Part 1: Morality and Society in Medieval Europe. It is the 12th century in Europe, and the continent breathes in rhythms both ancient and devout. The air of a medieval city carries the mingled scents of incense, hearth smoke, and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles from the chapel down the street. Bells toll from stone towers, marking not only the hours but the very heartbeat of life. To be alive in these centuries is to inhabit a world where the sacred and the ordinary are woven together so tightly that no thread can be cleanly separated. Morality is not a private code but a public compass. Every man and woman is born into a fabric of obligation, to God, to family, to guild, and to village. Sin and virtue are not abstractions, they are the invisible architecture of society, believed to shape harvests, fortunes, and even the weather. When crops fail or storms strike, confessionals fill with uneasy souls searching for the hidden fault that might have angered heaven. The medieval city is at once a marvel and a contradiction. Behind high walls and narrow gates lies a world both deeply pious and profoundly human. Pilgrims tramp through muddy streets on their way to holy shrines, monks copy scripture in dim cloisters, and merchants haggle under the gaze of carved saints. Yet within these same streets, one finds laughter, rumor, vice, and desire, all the impulses that define a people alive with longing and imperfection. The Church, which governs so much of daily life, preaches chastity and purity, yet it understands the nature of weakness too well to imagine a world free of it. Canon law regulates marriage, forbids adultery, and condemns lust, but bishops and priests know that human behavior will always spill beyond rules. This recognition, half merciful, half pragmatic, gives rise to a complicated moral order. Throughout medieval Europe, sin is not only a matter of the soul but of the city's peace. Theologians speak of virtue, but magistrates must keep order. As towns grow busier and denser, civic leaders begin to classify sins in practical terms, those that can be forgiven, and those that must be managed. Laws are written not only to punish, but to contain. It is in this tension between spiritual ideal and human necessity that medieval moral life takes its shape. The Church describes a perfect world, yet society must survive within an imperfect one. Peasants marry young, merchants seek profit, nobles pursue inheritance, and clergy attempt to shepherd them all through the hazards of temptation. The result is a culture simultaneously devout and pragmatic, one that seeks holiness but knows its own frailty too intimately to expect it. In monasteries and cathedrals, moral philosophy is studied with precision. Great thinkers such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas debate the nature of virtue and the role of reason in guiding the will. They write that sin, though universal, can be tempered by intention, that the mind, enlightened by divine law, can rule the body's passions. But outside these schools, life unfolds in rhythms of labor and love, of hardship and hope. Ordinary people understand morality less through philosophy than through ritual, confession, penance, and the rhythm of feast and fast. The confessional becomes one of the defining inventions of medieval spiritual life. Here, behind a lattice of wood or a curtain of humility, every person confronts both conscience and community. To confess is to unburden oneself, but also to acknowledge that sin affects all. It is a social act as much as a spiritual one. Through penance, the erring soul is reintegrated into society, and the fragile moral fabric is repaired. But beyond the church door, the secular world keeps its own counsel. Medieval towns are full of complexity, guild halls, markets, inns, and winding alleys that host not only trade but temptation. Taverns hum with stories and song, while public squares host festivals that blur the lines between celebration and sin. Moral order in these spaces is a negotiation between law and laughter. For women, morality is both shield and shackle. The ideal of chastity defines virtue, yet the economic reality of life offers few paths to security. Widows, unmarried women, and those born into poverty often navigate a world that values their virtue more than their survival. Many labor as servants or midwives, some rely on charity, others are drawn into lives the Church condemns but society quietly tolerates. Cities like Paris, Venice, and Florence begin to recognize this paradox. Civic leaders, guided by priests yet pressured by pragmatism, attempt to control vice not through eradication but through boundaries. Brothels and taverns are often regulated by law, a sign not of approval but of containment. Authorities hope that by confining vice, they can protect the rest of the city from moral contagion. Such measures reveal both the strength and the fragility of medieval morality. Sin, after all, cannot be confined to a district any more than the wind can be trapped in a room. The very act of regulation becomes a mirror reflecting society's contradictions, its desire for purity, its recognition of weakness, and its struggle to reconcile faith with flesh. In monasteries, sermons warn of temptation as a gateway to ruin. From pulpits, priests remind congregations that the body must serve the soul, not the other way around. But in the flicker of firelight, in the murmured prayers before sleep, people know that morality is not simple. It is lived, not merely preached. It is a daily balance between survival and salvation. Through this moral struggle, medieval Europe reveals its heart, not purely righteous, but deeply human. Its cities and villages pulse with effort, failure, and forgiveness. It is a world striving toward holiness, yet forever aware of its own shadow. And from that shadow, stories will emerge, of reformers and rulers, of preachers and poets, of the slow awakening of conscience that will shape centuries to come. The moral authority of the Church during the Middle Ages was both immense and intimate. It governed kings as it governed peasants, guiding not only salvation but social order. Every oath sworn, every contract signed, every marriage celebrated was bound within the language of faith. To live outside the moral boundaries of the Church was to live outside society itself. In the small villages scattered across Europe's fields, the Church's presence was constant. Its bells structured the day, morning prayers, noon blessings, evening mass. Festivals and saints' days broke the monotony of labor and hardship, providing moments of shared joy that tied entire communities together. Religion was not an abstract doctrine to these people, it was the rhythm of life, the pulse of time itself. Yet, within this rhythm, the clergy faced a challenge that was as old as civilization: how to balance ideal morality with the flawed realities of human behavior. The Church preached chastity and moderation, but in a world of poverty, war, and fragile peace, people sought comfort in one another, and not always within the bounds of marriage. Theologians could write of sin as corruption of the will, but magistrates and priests knew that sin was woven through the daily existence of the people they served. To maintain order, medieval authorities began to draw a line between personal sin and public disorder. Adultery, drunkenness, theft, and violence were not merely moral failings, they were threats to the fragile peace of the community. Civic laws, often drafted with clerical counsel, attempted to translate divine order into human justice. The result was an intricate web of moral regulation. In many cities, local councils published statutes listing forbidden acts and the penalties attached to them. Some of these laws were drawn directly from canon law, while others reflected local customs, a blend of spiritual concern and civic pragmatism. Markets, for example, were regulated not only to ensure fair prices but to prevent deception, which was considered both a legal crime and a sin. Inns were licensed to limit gambling and drunkenness. Certain types of labor were restricted on Sundays, so that even the humblest worker might attend Mass and rest. The Church supported these efforts but reminded rulers that law alone could not purify a people. Sin, it taught, could only be overcome by grace, a divine gift that no judge could bestow. Priests preached that mercy should temper justice, for even the most hardened sinner might yet repent. Still, the gap between principle and practice was wide. In cathedrals and town squares alike, sermons warned of corruption not only among the common folk but within the clergy itself. Wealthy bishops sometimes lived in comfort that rivaled princes, and monasteries, originally devoted to poverty, accumulated land and power. Reform movements arose again and again, Benedictine, Cistercian, and later Franciscan, each seeking to restore spiritual purity to a church grown entangled in the world it sought to save. In these centuries, morality became both a mirror and a measure of power. Kings claimed divine sanction for their rule, priests claimed divine authority for their teaching. Yet beneath these layers of hierarchy, the ordinary believer lived a far simpler version of morality, one shaped by family, survival, and the rhythms of work. To steal a loaf of bread in winter, to swear in anger, to miss Mass because the harvest would not wait, these were sins in the eyes of the Church, but to the peasant, they were part of being human. It was in confession that the moral dialogue between church and people found its most personal form. Introduced more formally in the 12th century, confession gave structure to guilt and forgiveness. Every year, each Christian was expected to confess their sins to a priest and receive absolution. This act transformed morality from a public code into an inner reckoning. For the first time in European history, conscience itself became an arena of discipline. The priest became both shepherd and gatekeeper, the interpreter of the soul's private ledger. His questions might be gentle or stern. Had the penitent lied, stolen, or harbored envy? Had they honored their spouse, avoided temptation, given alms? The answers were not only between sinner and God, they were part of the Church's vast effort to guide human conduct toward a divine ideal. Confession also revealed the Church's psychological insight. By teaching that sin could be forgiven through repentance, it offered release rather than despair. The sinner could fall and rise again, and the cycle of error and redemption became a rhythm as familiar as the seasons. Yet this same system of mercy reinforced control. For those who held the keys to forgiveness held immense power over the human spirit. In the growing cities of the High Middle Ages, where trade brought both wealth and temptation, moral anxiety deepened. New occupations, new freedoms, and new forms of pleasure tested old values. As men and women mingled in marketplaces and guild halls, the guardians of virtue worried about the erosion of discipline. Civic councils sought to codify behavior, while preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of vanity and greed. In Florence, the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola would later become infamous for urging the destruction of luxury and vice, a reminder that moral reform often burns as fiercely as the sins it condemns. In other cities, moral regulation took quieter forms: curfews for apprentices, fines for public disorder, and the careful oversight of taverns and theaters. For women, moral expectations grew heavier with each generation. Society viewed female virtue as the cornerstone of order, and any deviation from chastity was judged harshly. Yet these same societies offered women few means to live honorably outside of marriage. The tension was cruel and constant. Women were held to ideals that often ignored the economic realities of their lives. Religious institutions provided some refuge: convents for the devout, alms for widows, but for many, morality was less a path to sanctity than a daily struggle for survival within a system that measured them by purity more than by personhood. In time, these contradictions would give rise to reform, to voices that questioned whether society's obsession with controlling sin had blinded it to compassion. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, such questions were rarely asked aloud. The moral order of medieval Europe rested upon obedience to God, to the Church, to one's place in the social hierarchy. To question that order was to risk chaos. And yet, beneath the surface of obedience, a quiet evolution was already beginning. In the cities, literacy spread, scholars rediscovered ancient philosophy, merchants and travelers brought stories of distant lands with different customs. Slowly, imperceptibly, Europe's moral imagination began to widen. The foundations of later reform were being laid, not by rebellion, but by reflection. The medieval world, for all its rigid hierarchies, contained within it the seeds of transformation. Its confessions, its sermons, and its laws were not merely instruments of control, they were also expressions of the human desire to live rightly in a complex world. And though that world was far from just, its struggles with morality would shape centuries of conscience to come. By the 14th century, the medieval world had begun to change in ways its ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The great cathedrals still stood, their spires piercing the sky like prayers in stone, yet below their shadows, a more restless Europe stirred. Towns grew busier, trade richer, and with prosperity came new complexities of conscience. Morality was still measured by faith, but the realities of daily life had grown too intricate for ancient codes to govern easily. Famine, plague, and war left deep marks upon the collective mind. The Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in 1347, killing nearly a third of its people, brought not only grief but introspection. When so many died despite prayers and penance, many began to wonder whether sin could truly explain suffering. Fear turned to repentance, but also to reflection. In the years that followed, sermons grew more somber, art more introspective, and the confessional more crowded. Yet amid this atmosphere of mortality and moral scrutiny, something new began to stir, a quiet awareness of individual responsibility and compassion that went beyond fear. It was not that medieval people ceased to believe in sin or salvation, but that they began to look at morality as something lived between people, not just between humanity and God. In towns and cities, charitable guilds multiplied. These organizations, often formed by merchants, artisans, or religious fraternities, took it upon themselves to feed the hungry, care for orphans, and support widows. They did so in the name of virtue, but their work carried a deeper message, that society could act collectively to ease suffering rather than merely condemn it as divine punishment. Monasteries and convents, too, renewed their missions. Many opened infirmaries and guest houses, offering shelter to travelers and care to the sick. Pilgrims on the roads to Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome often found refuge in these humble halls. The idea that mercy was itself a form of holiness, that to serve the broken was to serve God, began to take firmer root. Still, the late Middle Ages were full of contradictions. The same cities that built hospitals also built prisons. The same rulers who founded almshouses waged wars that left thousands destitute. Compassion and cruelty lived side by side, as they often do in times of upheaval. Theologians debated the nature of virtue. Thomas Aquinas, a century earlier, had defined it as a habit of the soul inclined toward good. But as society changed, the good itself became harder to define. Was it obedience to law, or mercy to those who broke it? Was holiness measured by purity or by love? Preachers wrestled with these questions from pulpits across Europe. In Florence, the fiery Girolamo Savonarola thundered that cities must purge themselves of vanity and vice if they were to survive divine wrath. In England, voices like John Wycliffe began to question whether the Church's wealth and hierarchy had obscured Christ's original message of humility. Such men were both admired and feared, for their passion for reform seemed at times to border on heresy. The people themselves lived between these great currents, devout, weary, pragmatic. In rural villages, morality remained tied to survival. The harvest, the weather, the landlord's demands, these dictated right and wrong more directly than abstract theology. In the towns, where wealth and poverty stood face to face, morality was measured in the market as much as in the monastery. Fair trade, honest weights, and the keeping of oaths were seen as acts of virtue equal to prayer. The late medieval conscience was thus neither static nor simple. It was expanding, groping toward what might later be called social ethics, a sense that justice required more than punishment, and piety more than obedience. Literature reflected this shift. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer portrayed pilgrims not as saints or sinners, but as flawed, vivid individuals. His humor and compassion captured a new way of seeing morality, as a spectrum of human imperfection rather than a ledger of sins. Even within the Church, quiet renewal was underway. Orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans sought to bridge the gap between clergy and commoners. They preached in marketplaces, in the vernacular tongue, using stories rather than Latin disputations. They spoke of God not as a distant judge, but as a presence among the poor. Their message was both simple and profound, that holiness could dwell in humility, and that compassion was a higher law than fear. This movement toward empathy would not erase Europe's moral rigidity, that would take centuries more, but it planted something enduring. When later reformers and humanists looked back on the medieval world, they saw not only superstition and oppression, but also the seeds of moral awakening that would one day blossom into modern conscience. By the close of the 15th century, Europe was poised upon the edge of transformation. The Renaissance was dawning in Italy, printing presses were beginning to hum in Germany, explorers were sailing toward unknown worlds. Old certainties trembled beneath new questions. And though faith still ruled the heart of society, its shape was changing, shifting from commandment to compassion, from control to conscience. The moral imagination of medieval Europe had been tested by plague and poverty, by sin and sanctity alike. What endured through all of it was the belief that life was not only a trial but a journey, one that could be redeemed through mercy as much as through law. As the medieval twilight deepened into the Renaissance dawn, Europe would carry forward both the burden of its sins and the light of its compassion. And in that uneasy balance between judgment and grace, the story of morality would continue, shaped by every age, yet echoing the same eternal human struggle to live rightly in a broken world. Part 2: The Renaissance and the Reawakening of Conscience. The medieval centuries had taught Europe humility, the long rhythm of prayer and toil, the fragile peace between faith and fear. But as the 15th century unfolded, a quiet transformation began. Across Italy first, then through France, England, and the German lands, the light of curiosity returned. Scholars, artists, and thinkers began to rediscover the wisdom of the ancients, and with it came a new way of seeing the human soul. It was not rebellion against God, but a reawakening of what was divine within humanity itself. The Renaissance, as it would later be called, was not born in a single moment or city, but in the countless acts of people who began to look at the world and at themselves with renewed wonder. Painters studied the curves of the body not merely as flesh, but as geometry in motion, reflections of divine proportion. Philosophers turned to Aristotle and Plato not to replace scripture, but to find harmony between reason and revelation. The human being, once seen primarily as a sinner struggling toward salvation, now appeared also as a creature of possibility, capable of thought, creativity, and virtue in this life, not only the next. In Florence, the city of merchants and marble, this awakening took form in the work of thinkers such as Leonardo Bruni, who spoke of civic virtue as a duty to both heaven and the Republic. To live well was no longer defined solely by obedience, but by participation, by learning, by action, by generosity. The Christian ideal of charity blended with the classical ideal of excellence, producing a moral vision that was both practical and profound. The artists of the age made visible what philosophers only whispered. Leonardo da Vinci, with his endless sketches of machines, anatomy, and flight, turned study itself into worship, an exploration of God's creation through observation. Michelangelo, carving David from a block of marble, captured not a saint or king, but a man poised between fear and courage, doubt and faith, the moral tension of every soul rendered in stone. The Renaissance conscience was shaped not by rejection of religion, but by curiosity. In monasteries and universities alike, people began to ask, what if the pursuit of knowledge was itself a form of devotion? If God had given humanity intellect and imagination, perhaps to use them fully was not pride, but praise. The faith that had once turned inward now looked outward, seeing creation as a mirror of its creator's mind. This shift also touched ordinary life. In growing cities, merchants who once measured virtue by charity began to see honesty in trade as a moral act in itself. Educators such as Vittorino da Feltri in Italy and later Erasmus of Rotterdam in the north championed the idea that moral character could be formed through learning, not fear, that teaching virtue was as important as teaching grammar. The schools they founded blended scripture with the classics, producing a generation that saw conscience as reason guided by grace. Yet this new humanism carried contradictions. The Renaissance celebrated freedom and dignity, but that freedom was not shared equally. The poor remained bound to labor. Women, though praised in poetry, were often confined in life. The same age that painted the Virgin with tenderness still measured virtue by the silence of daughters and the obedience of wives. The reawakening of conscience was real, but it was uneven, an ideal not yet fully lived. Still, something essential had changed. Morality was no longer only dictated from pulpits, it began to be discovered within the heart. The language of sermons shifted from condemnation to contemplation. The confessional, once a place of fear, became a place of introspection. Writers such as Michel de Montaigne later turned that introspection into art, writing essays that asked not what people should think, but how they actually do. To understand oneself became a moral act. Even the church, faced with new learning and the printing press, began to evolve. Though wary of excess curiosity, many popes became patrons of the arts and letters, believing beauty could lead souls toward God. The Sistine Chapel, with its vast frescoes of creation and judgment, embodied the paradox of the age, faith rendered through reason, eternity painted in human form. Yet beneath the brilliance lay unease. As literacy spread and the Bible was translated into vernacular tongues, more people began to interpret faith for themselves. Printing, that quiet revolution of metal and ink, carried not only art and philosophy but dissent. The same conscience that inspired humanism would soon question authority itself, and from that questioning, reformation would come. But before the storms of protest and reform, the Renaissance stood as a rare moment of balance, when faith and reason, beauty and belief, seemed almost in harmony. The moral imagination, once constrained by fear of sin, now dared to celebrate the goodness of creation and the dignity of the mind. In quiet studies and crowded workshops, in cloisters and marketplaces, Europe had begun to rediscover something ancient and essential, that to be human was not a punishment, but a privilege, that knowledge and virtue were not opposites, but companions on the same path toward understanding. This was the reawakening of conscience, the rediscovery that morality was not imposed from above, but cultivated from within. The Renaissance taught Europe that goodness could be thoughtful, that faith could be curious, and that the soul, like art, could reflect both heaven and the earth beneath its feet. And from this new awareness, fragile, luminous, and human, the modern moral world would slowly unfold. Part 3: The Reformation and the Battle for the Human Soul. The dawn of the 16th century rose over a Europe shimmering with confidence. Printing presses clicked in every city, paintings glowed with divine light, and the air of possibility hung heavy in every university hall. Yet beneath this flourishing surface lay disquiet, a deep and growing unease with the institutions that claimed to speak for God. The Church had guided Europe for 1,000 years, but now its grandeur cast long shadows. Where faith once inspired awe, it now stirred doubt. The age of reform was at hand, and in its arrival, the very soul of Christendom trembled. For centuries, salvation had been a collective path. The sacraments, the priesthood, the liturgy, these were the bridges between heaven and earth. The faithful did not question their structure, for they believed grace flowed through the hands of the Church itself. But now, whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to defiance. The idea that one might speak to God without the mediation of Rome began to stir in the hearts of scholars, preachers, and ordinary men and women alike. The printing press, that quiet miracle of metal and ink, became the first instrument of rebellion. Books once chained to monasteries now filled the hands of merchants and cobblers. Among them were not only works of philosophy and poetry, but the sacred scriptures themselves, printed, for the first time, in languages the people could understand. To read the Bible in one's own tongue was to see faith anew, and to some, it felt like revelation. In Germany, a monk named Martin Luther found himself tormented not by doubt in God, but by despair over human unworthiness. He had followed every ritual, confessed every fault, fasted until his body trembled, yet still he felt unredeemed. His studies led him to a single, blazing conclusion: salvation was not earned by deeds or indulgences, but granted through faith alone. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg's church in 1517, he did not imagine that the sound of his hammer would echo across continents. But it did. Luther's protest was theological, yet its consequences were human. His words spread like wildfire through Europe, copied and carried by the presses. To some, he was a prophet reclaiming purity, to others, a heretic dismantling order. But what began as a dispute over indulgences became something far larger, a battle for the meaning of conscience itself. If salvation came by faith alone, then every soul stood directly before God, unmediated, equal, responsible. This idea shattered the old hierarchy of priest and penitent, bishop and believer. It replaced obedience with conviction, ceremony with scripture, fear with faith. But such freedom came with cost. A world long bound by one church now splintered into many, each claiming truth. As reform spread, other voices rose. Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich sought to strip away ritual entirely, declaring that only scripture should guide worship. John Calvin in Geneva spoke of God's sovereignty and humanity's frailty, shaping a vision of disciplined faith that would influence nations for centuries. Even within Catholic lands, reform-minded thinkers such as Erasmus of Rotterdam pleaded for renewal through learning and compassion rather than division. But history rarely chooses moderation. Across Europe, pulpits thundered, and cities divided. Where once bells had united communities in prayer, now they marked allegiance, Protestant or Catholic, Reformer or Loyalist. Families were torn apart, monasteries emptied, and fields burned in wars fought not only for power, but for the human soul. The violence was tragic, yet within the storm, conscience awakened. People who had once relied on priests to interpret faith now had to interpret it for themselves. To read scripture became an act of courage. To pray in secret, a declaration of freedom. Each believer, for the first time, was asked to decide what truth meant, and how far they were willing to suffer for it. For many, this was liberation. In the new Protestant congregations, worship became simpler, the focus turned inward. Hymns replaced chants, sermons replaced rituals. The word took precedence over the altar. But the freedom to interpret scripture also carried the peril of fragmentation. Dozens of sects emerged, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, each reading the same texts and arriving at different visions of God's will. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, shaken but unbroken, began its own renewal. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, reaffirmed doctrine and sought to cleanse corruption. New orders such as the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, dedicated themselves to education, charity, and the defense of the faith through intellect rather than force. The Counter-Reformation, though born of crisis, rekindled devotion and art. In its wake rose cathedrals that seemed to breathe light, the Baroque age of grandeur and grace. Through all this, Europe's moral compass shifted. The individual, once a small part of a collective body, now stood alone before God. Personal conscience became the final measure of virtue. Salvation was no longer a matter of belonging, but of belief. The tension between faith and freedom that began here would ripple through every later century, shaping philosophy, politics, and identity itself. The Reformation was not only a religious revolution, it was a mirror of the human condition. It revealed how the search for purity can divide as easily as it unites, how truth can inspire both love and cruelty. It showed that conscience, once awakened, cannot easily be silenced, but also that freedom of faith brings the weight of moral solitude. By the time the wars subsided, Europe was changed beyond recognition. The map of faith had been redrawn, the authority of Rome had been challenged. And the idea of personal moral responsibility had taken root. It was an age of tragedy and transcendence, where the price of spiritual awakening was often blood. Yet even in the ruins, something endured, the belief that faith must be lived, not inherited. That salvation could not be sold, nor conscience commanded. That the human soul, though frail and fallible, carried within it the capacity to reach toward the divine without intermediaries. In this, the Reformation left its deepest mark. It turned morality inward, teaching humanity to listen not only to authority but to the quiet voice within. And though the centuries would bring new philosophies, revolutions, and empires, the echo of that awakening, the insistence that truth must be personal, that belief must be chosen, would never fade. The Renaissance had rediscovered human dignity. The Reformation had rediscovered human conscience. And from their union, both tender and tumultuous, the modern world began to emerge. Part 4, The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. The 17th century opened upon a Europe still trembling from the thunder of reform. The scars of religious wars ran deep, whole regions burned and rebuilt, altars shattered and raised anew. Yet amid the ashes, a quieter revolution began. Where armies had once fought for doctrine, minds now turned to questions that neither sword nor sermon could resolve. What is truth? What is virtue? What is the nature of human reason? Thus dawned the Enlightenment, a movement of thought rather than conquest, a reimagining of morality built not upon fear or faith alone, but upon the power of understanding. In this new dawn, candles replaced torches, libraries replaced fortresses, and the pen became mightier than the pulpit. Across Europe, salons filled with conversation. Philosophers, scientists, and poets gathered in candlelit rooms where the air buzzed with debate. They spoke not of miracles, but of laws, of gravity, motion, and the mind itself. For the first time in centuries, humanity dared to believe that reason, that quiet compass within, might guide the soul as surely as revelation. The seeds of this awakening had been sown by the Reformation's insistence on individual thought. Now they flowered into confidence, a belief that truth could be discovered through observation, inquiry, and reflection. Faith had once governed knowledge, now knowledge began to question faith. Yet this questioning was not always defiant. Many saw it as a continuation of divine order. If the world was God's creation, then to study it with clarity was to honor its maker. René Descartes, sitting before a fire in the cold of a Dutch winter, began to doubt everything except his own capacity to think. "I think, therefore I am," he concluded, and with that phrase he placed consciousness itself at the center of existence. His reasoning was not rebellion but renewal, a belief that certainty, like faith, must begin from within. From this spark, philosophy stretched outward into vast questions. If reason defines being, then what guides morality? Can the human mind, through reflection, discern good and evil without revelation? Others carried the torch of inquiry further. Baruch Spinoza, lens grinder and philosopher, imagined a God not enthroned above creation but present within it, a divine substance flowing through all things. For this, he was exiled, condemned by those who feared his vision blurred the boundary between sacred and human. Yet his ideas endured, influencing generations who saw in them a kind of moral liberation, that goodness might be found not in obedience but in harmony with nature itself. As science advanced, faith adapted. Isaac Newton revealed a universe governed by mathematical law, a cosmos of precision and elegance. His discovery suggested that the world was not a stage of arbitrary miracles, but a masterpiece of divine logic. To some, this strengthened belief; to others, it replaced mystery with mechanism. The same heavens that once inspired prayer now inspired calculation. The telescope became a new altar, the stars a scripture written in numbers. But the Enlightenment was not confined to laboratories and academies. Its heartbeat pulsed through coffeehouses, pamphlets, and parliaments. Thinkers such as John Locke argued that reason was not only a tool of science but the foundation of government and morality. He wrote that all people were born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that to protect these rights was the highest moral duty of any state. In his words, morality moved from heaven to earth, from eternal decree to human dignity. The idea was radical. For centuries, rulers had claimed authority by divine right. Now philosophers suggested that power must answer to reason, that the governed were not subjects but citizens. Across Europe, this notion of moral equality spread like dawn across the hills. It whispered in the writings of Voltaire, who mocked the arrogance of kings and priests, and it thundered in the treatises of Rousseau, who declared that society itself must be a moral contract, built upon the collective will of free individuals. For the first time, morality was described in secular terms, not as the echo of divine law, but as the logic of coexistence. Yet the Enlightenment did not abolish faith, it refined it. Many thinkers believed that God was the great clockmaker who had set the universe in motion, leaving humanity to govern itself through reason. Others, uneasy with such distance, sought a synthesis, a moral life that honored both science and spirit. As ideas spread, the landscape of Europe changed. The printing press, once the herald of religious division, now carried essays, letters, and revolutionary tracts across borders. Education expanded beyond monasteries. Women, though still constrained by tradition, began to write and reason in public, Mary Wollstonecraft in England and Madame de Staël in France calling for moral equality between the sexes. Their words hinted at revolutions yet to come, for the Enlightenment had opened not only the mind but the possibility of justice. But reason, like all light, cast its own shadows. Some began to believe that logic alone could perfect humanity, that emotion and faith were remnants of ignorance. The dream of a purely rational world, orderly, precise, and unerring, seduced kings and scholars alike. Yet beneath this confidence, Europe's old wounds remained: poverty, pride, and the hunger for meaning that reason alone could not satisfy. In quiet moments, even the great thinkers felt this absence. Pascal, mathematician and mystic, wrote that reason could only take humanity so far, and beyond it lay the heart, which has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. His words bridged the chasm between intellect and spirit, reminding a dazzled age that the soul, too, required nourishment. As the 18th century ripened, the Enlightenment reached its height. Universities thrived, encyclopedias compiled all known knowledge, and monarchs styled themselves as enlightened despots, ruling with reforms and rational laws. To be civilized was to be reasonable, to be moral was to be moderate. Europe, once guided by faith's invisible hand, now charted its course by the light of the mind. Yet beneath the harmony of reason, another rhythm began to stir, the pulse of revolution. The idea that all men were created equal demanded to be lived, not merely written. In America, colonists invoked Enlightenment ideals to cast off monarchy. In France, philosophers' words became banners, and reason, once gentle, turned fierce. The guillotine would later stand as reason's dark twin, the logic of justice stripped of mercy. Even so, the Enlightenment had done something irreversible. It had taught Europe to see morality not as obedience but as choice, not as inheritance but as responsibility. It had given humanity a mirror in which to see its own capacity for both brilliance and error. Faith would remain, but no longer as master. It would now walk beside reason, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. When the salons grew silent and the candles burned low, what lingered from this age was not certainty but curiosity, a conviction that truth, however elusive, could be pursued with both humility and hope. The Enlightenment did not end belief, it expanded it. It invited humanity to see the moral life as an unfinished project, a collaboration between the divine and the human mind. And so Europe stepped into the modern age, carrying with it two lights, faith and reason. One glowed softly with ancient devotion, the other blazed with new understanding. Together they illuminated a path neither could walk alone, a path that led not to perfection but to the enduring, restless pursuit of truth. Part 5, Revolution, Romanticism, and the Moral Imagination. The close of the 18th century did not whisper, it roared. The serene confidence of the Enlightenment gave way to thunder and upheaval. In France, the streets ran with both passion and blood, and the bright ideals of liberty and equality met the darker realities of fear and vengeance. Monarchies trembled, empires cracked, and the very concept of morality was rewritten under the weight of revolution. The world that had once trusted reason to guide its steps now found itself asking what reason could not answer: what becomes of virtue when order collapses? What becomes of humanity when freedom turns to chaos? The French Revolution began with words, pamphlets, declarations, and debates, but it ended with fire. The same printing presses that once spread the treatises of Voltaire now carried the decrees of assemblies, the speeches of radicals, and the cries of those who demanded justice in the name of the people. For a time, morality seemed democratic, reborn in the language of rights rather than dogma. Yet as heads fell beneath the guillotine, the line between righteousness and retribution blurred. The Enlightenment's dream of a rational utopia had been tested, and the test had torn the dream apart. Still, from the ashes rose a new sensibility, a longing for something beyond logic, beyond systems and symmetry. The human heart, bruised by revolution and disillusionment, began to seek refuge in feeling, in nature, in the mysterious depths of the soul. Thus dawned the Romantic Age, not in defiance of reason but in recognition of its limits. Where philosophers had once mapped the world in the language of the intellect, poets now sought to rediscover its spirit. In the green valleys of England, William Wordsworth walked among the hills and spoke of moral truth not as law but as empathy. To him, virtue was not found in institutions but in the quiet bond between humanity and the natural world. In his verses, the moral life became an act of attention to beauty, to suffering, to the sacred in the everyday. His friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge followed the same path through the mist of imagination, seeing in poetry a means to reconcile reason and faith, to weave the visible and invisible into one living whole. Across Europe, the same spirit stirred. Goethe in Germany wrote of human striving and imperfection, seeing in the restless soul of Faust both the glory and the peril of ambition. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings had inspired revolution, became the prophet of authenticity, the belief that goodness lay not in conformity but in sincerity, that the heart uncorrupted by vanity might glimpse truth more clearly than the mind clouded by pride. To live morally, Rousseau said, was to live in harmony with one's nature, not merely with one's nation. The Romantic movement was as much a moral revolution as an artistic one. It reclaimed the inner life, insisting that feeling was not weakness but wisdom, that compassion was as vital to the soul as logic to the mind. Painters and musicians joined poets in this reawakening. Turner captured the sublime in storm and sunlight, showing how beauty and terror coexisted in the natural world. Beethoven, in his symphonies, gave sound to the moral grandeur and sorrow of being human, a cry of defiance and hope that echoed far beyond concert halls. In these works, morality became something intimate and experiential. It was not decreed from above or codified in law, but discovered through emotion, struggle, and imagination. The romantic conscience was no longer satisfied with rules, it demanded meaning. The poet's pen and the composer's bow became instruments of moral reflection, translating grief, joy, and awe into languages the intellect could not fully grasp. But even as Romanticism exalted the spirit, the world around it was changing once again. The Industrial Revolution spread through Europe like a second fire, this one fed by coal and ambition. Cities rose where meadows had been. Machines sang where rivers once murmured. Progress, once the promise of philosophers, became the creed of merchants and kings. Yet progress brought its own darkness, smoke-choked skies, endless labor, and the quiet suffering of the poor. In this new landscape, morality faced another test. The factories of Manchester and the mines of Wales became the silent conscience of an age obsessed with advancement. Writers like Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo began to chronicle this moral dissonance, how society's triumphs concealed its injustices. Their stories were not only social critiques but acts of empathy, pleas for the heart to keep pace with the mind. Dickens' orphaned children and Hugo's condemned men stood as mirrors to civilization itself, asking whether moral progress could exist without compassion. Meanwhile, revolution did not fade, it evolved. In 1848, uprisings erupted across Europe, driven by hunger, hope, and the yearning for dignity. The dream of equality still burned, but now it sought to unite economic and moral reform. Philosophers like Karl Marx argued that morality was bound to material conditions, that justice required more than sentiment, that it demanded the transformation of society itself. His call for revolution was as moral as it was political, though it would echo in ways he could scarcely imagine. The Romantic century, from Rousseau to Marx, from Byron's verse to Beethoven's chords, left Europe forever changed. It had reawakened conscience not as doctrine but as imagination, a recognition that to be moral was to feel deeply, to act with both courage and compassion, to see oneself in the suffering of others. The moral imagination had become the new temple of Europe, standing alongside the laboratory and the library as places where humanity sought truth. And yet, as the century waned, that imagination faced new shadows. Science advanced further, questioning mysteries once thought eternal. Darwin's theory of evolution placed humanity not at the center of creation but within it, a creature among creatures, shaped by struggle and chance. Some saw in this revelation a loss of meaning, others, a deeper wonder, that morality might itself be the highest expression of life's long ascent toward awareness. As the 19th century closed, Europe found itself poised between two worlds, the world of feeling and the world of fact, the age of heart and the age of reason. The Romantic moral vision had taught humanity to see beauty in imperfection, holiness in compassion, and redemption in the act of understanding. But the next era would demand something even greater, the courage to face modernity itself, with its machines, its empires, and its endless hunger for progress, without losing the fragile light of conscience that had carried civilization this far. The battle for the soul of Europe had moved from altar to mind, from mind to heart, and soon it would move to the machines of industry and the streets of revolution. Yet through all the change, one truth endured, the search for what is good, what is just, what is human. And as long as that search continued, the moral imagination would not fade. It would adapt, as it always had, to the new century's storms. Part 6, Industry, Empire, and the Shadow of Progress. The 19th century dawned with the hum of engines and the gleam of iron rails stretching across the land. The age of reason had given birth to an age of invention. Steamships crossed oceans where sails once drifted, and locomotives carved through countryside that had for centuries moved only at the pace of a horse's gait. The world was no longer vast and unchanging, it was restless, in motion, alive with the promise of progress. Yet beneath the glitter of innovation lay a quiet unease. For with every new machine came a new question: if humanity could master nature, could it also master itself? Factories rose where fields had been, their chimneys trailing smoke that dimmed the sun. Towns expanded like living organisms, their streets thick with noise and labor. Men, women, and even children worked long hours for meager pay, their hands and lungs feeding the hunger of industry. The rhythm of life, once tied to the seasons, now bowed to the clock. Time itself had become a commodity, measured in wages and shifts. Progress marched forward, but morality struggled to keep pace. Writers and reformers began to look upon this industrial landscape and see not triumph, but tragedy. The soot-stained faces of factory workers, the cramped tenements, the exhaustion that dulled even the desire for beauty, these became the new symbols of the age. Charles Dickens, walking through London's fog, turned the suffering he witnessed into stories that demanded empathy. In Hard Times, he portrayed a world where children were taught facts but denied wonder, where workers were reduced to numbers, and where compassion itself seemed obsolete. His novels were not mere entertainment, they were moral sermons in disguise, asking readers to remember the humanity buried beneath progress. Across the Channel, Victor Hugo did the same in France. His Les Miserables gave voice to the outcast, the poor, and the condemned, insisting that a society's worth was measured not by its wealth but by its mercy. In his vision, redemption was the truest revolution. Where governments legislated reform, literature cultivated conscience. The pen, once again, became the quiet weapon of the moral imagination. And yet, as cities grew and economies expanded, Europe's reach extended far beyond its shores. The age of industry became the age of empire. Steam and steel carried not only goods but power, to Africa, to Asia, to the Pacific. Flags rose over foreign lands in the name of civilization, commerce, and faith. But behind this rhetoric of enlightenment lay ambition. The moral paradox of empire was as old as conquest itself. How could nations that preached liberty justify dominion over others? In London, Paris, and Berlin, imperialism was draped in the language of progress. Missionaries spoke of saving souls, industrialists spoke of modernizing nations, statesmen spoke of order and peace. Yet in the colonies, lives were uprooted, cultures suppressed, and voices silenced. Whole civilizations were treated as raw material for Europe's grand experiment in modernity. The same machines that built bridges at home now extracted wealth abroad. A few, even among the powerful, sensed the dissonance. John Stuart Mill, philosopher and economist, wrote of liberty as a moral necessity, insisting that the freedom of thought and action was sacred to human dignity. His essays asked whether domination could ever be moral, whether the advance of civilization justified the subjugation of others. In these questions, the conscience of Europe stirred uneasily. But such reflections were often drowned out by the clamor of progress and pride. Within Europe itself, new moral frontiers emerged. The labor movement took shape, demanding justice not through charity but through rights. Trade unions formed, strikes erupted, and governments struggled to balance order with fairness. Reformers like Robert Owen in Britain and Friedrich Engels in Germany began to envision societies where cooperation replaced exploitation, where progress served people rather than consuming them. At the same time, moral thought began to intertwine with science. The theories of Charles Darwin, published in On the Origin of Species, revolutionized humanity's understanding of itself. Life was no longer a static hierarchy ordained by God but a vast, evolving continuum. For some, this discovery inspired awe, a vision of creation more intricate than ever imagined. For others, it shattered certainty. If humanity was shaped by nature rather than destiny, what did that mean for morality? Was virtue itself a product of evolution, a survival strategy rather than a divine command? Thinkers wrestled with these questions. Some saw in evolution a new moral order, one that emphasized empathy as the foundation of survival. Others twisted Darwin's ideas into justifications for inequality, arguing that progress required struggle, that the strong must rise while the weak must fall. This grim philosophy, later called social Darwinism, revealed the danger of progress without compassion. Science had expanded knowledge, but it could not replace conscience. Amid this intellectual turbulence, faith persisted, though it too transformed. The Church, confronted by science and social change, sought new ways to speak to an industrial people. Sermons echoed in city streets as preachers called for kindness amid the smoke and steel. The social gospel movement emerged, teaching that salvation was not only a matter of belief but of justice, that to care for the poor and oppressed was itself an act of faith. the moral landscape of the 19th century was a mosaic of contrasts. In one corner stood invention and discovery, in another, poverty and despair. Yet through it all ran a single thread: the belief that progress must have purpose. The artists, the thinkers, the reformers all shared one conviction, that advancement without empathy was hollow, that the true measure of civilization lay not in what it built, but in whom it lifted. By the century's end, Europe stood taller than ever, its cities electrified, its railways endless, its empires vast. But beneath the surface gleamed a fragile unease. Machines could forge metal, but not meaning. Science could illuminate the universe, but not the heart. The same power that drove progress could, if untamed, destroy the very humanity it claimed to serve. In this tension between greatness and guilt, the modern conscience took shape. The industrial age had taught humankind to conquer the physical world, now it would have to learn how to govern the moral one. For the first time, people began to speak not only of invention but of responsibility, not only of freedom but of empathy. As the 19th century drew to a close, the lights of the modern world burned bright against the night sky. Yet in their glow, one could almost see the faint outline of a shadow, a reminder that every act of creation casts one. And within that shadow stirred the questions that would define the century to come: could progress and morality coexist? Could humanity master its machines without losing its soul? The next century would offer its answers, some noble, others devastating. But for now, the world stood poised at the threshold, caught between the optimism of the future and the lingering conscience of the past, unsure whether the dawn it had created would bring enlightenment or fire. Part 7: The Age of Conflict and Conscience, the World Wars. The 20th century began with a tremor of pride and a whisper of dread. The cities of Europe glittered with invention, electricity ran through their streets, airplanes traced their skies, and the sciences promised to conquer disease, distance, and ignorance alike. Humanity had never seemed so powerful. The poets of the New Age called it progress, the statesmen called it destiny. But progress, as the 19th century had already begun to show, is a double-edged light. Behind the brilliance of the modern world, shadows lengthened. Empires, their banners still bright from industrial triumph, now gazed hungrily across borders. Nations built weapons with the same confidence they built railways, believing technology itself a guarantee of victory. Pride, that ancient sin, disguised itself as patriotism. In the summer of 1914, one gunshot in Sarajevo echoed through an entire civilization, and the world slid into war before it truly understood what war had become. The First World War was unlike anything before it. Trenches cut through the countryside like wounds that would not heal. The old chivalry of battle vanished beneath barbed wire and smoke. Men fought not with swords or honor, but with gas, machine guns, and artillery that turned daylight into thunder. Europe, once the heart of art and philosophy, became a battlefield of mud and grief. The moral imagination that had once built cathedrals and symphonies was now consumed by survival. For those who lived through it, the war shattered faith, not only in nations, but in meaning itself. Millions died in fields whose names became synonymous with futility: Verdun, the Somme, Ypres. When the guns fell silent in 1918, an entire generation of poets and thinkers returned home changed. Wilfred Owen wrote of pity and horror, Eric Marie a remark of disillusion and loss. The old moral certainties had drowned in the trenches. In the aftermath, Europe's conscience faltered. The war had promised to end all wars, yet it had only broken the illusion of progress. The grandeur of empire had turned to ashes, and the faith in reason that had defined the Enlightenment now seemed naive. How could the same intellect that built telescopes and symphonies also build weapons that devoured millions? The 20th century began to sense that knowledge alone was not enough, that humanity's genius, untempered by humility, could destroy as easily as it created. In the uneasy peace that followed, artists and philosophers sought meaning in the ruins. The existentialists of Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, declared that morality must be reclaimed not from God or government, but from the individual conscience. If the universe was indifferent, they said, then goodness must come from choice, not command. Camus, haunted by war and resistance, wrote that to rebel against absurdity was itself a moral act, to affirm life even when meaning was uncertain. But before these ideas could mature, the world once again descended into chaos. The rise of fascism and totalitarianism revealed how fragile the moral structure of civilization truly was. In Germany, Italy, and beyond, fear and hunger made fertile ground for ideology. Charismatic leaders promised order, unity, and pride to societies weary of humiliation and loss. The machine age, which had promised liberation, now offered the means for domination. Propaganda, radio, and mass industry turned politics into theater and obedience into virtue. By the late 1930s, the world stood again at the edge. When the Second Great War began, it moved with a speed and ferocity the first had never known. Civilians became targets, cities burned from the air. Technology had evolved, but morality lagged behind. The horrors of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Nanking tore open the fabric of conscience itself. Humanity, at the height of its scientific power, confronted the abyss of its own cruelty. In the camps, faith was tested beyond endurance. Some lost it entirely, others clung to it more fiercely than ever. Thinkers like Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in the Holocaust, would later write that even in the darkest conditions, meaning could not be destroyed. That the last freedom of the human being was the ability to choose one's attitude, to remain kind even when the world was merciless. His words became a testament not to optimism, but to endurance, a fragile defiance in the face of despair. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world was quieter, but never the same. Cities lay in ruins, empires crumbled, and the great moral traditions of Europe stood in question. Out of the devastation, the idea of universal human rights was born, a collective confession that the dignity of life must never again be so easily discarded. From the ashes of the camps and the wreckage of cities rose new words that tried to hold meaning together: justice, freedom, memory. But memory itself was heavy. The 20th century had seen what the Enlightenment could not imagine, that reason without compassion could become tyranny, that civilization could coexist with barbarism. In that realization lay both despair and a new humility. The age of conflict had exposed humanity's dual nature, capable of beauty, capable of atrocity, both born of the same restless intelligence. In the years that followed, the moral imagination tried once more to rebuild. Writers like George Orwell warned of the seductions of power, while theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, executed for defying tyranny, taught that faith without moral courage was hollow. The post-war world turned to rebuilding not only cities, but conscience. Education, philosophy, and law sought to make memory a form of protection, to remind future generations of what forgetting could cost. And yet, even as peace returned, a new tension emerged. The atomic age dawned with a brilliance that frightened as much as it awed. Humanity now held the power to destroy itself with the press of a button. Science had achieved its highest mastery, and morality stood trembling beside it, asking once again whether progress was still a blessing or had become a curse. The 20th century, once proud of its reason, now began to fear its own creations. But within that fear grew something new, a deeper, quieter wisdom. The survivors of the wars, the artists and teachers and ordinary citizens who endured, carried with them not triumph but tenderness. They knew that the greatest moral act was no longer to conquer, but to care. From the ruins of the old world emerged a fragile conscience, one that no longer trusted institutions blindly, but still believed in the worth of the individual soul. It was a morality born of suffering, shaped not by certainty but by empathy. And though the century ahead would bring new conflicts and questions, it would also bring a new kind of faith, not in empires or ideologies, but in the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The world had changed, but the moral journey continued. For all its destruction, the age of war had taught humanity something precious, that goodness must be guarded not by power, but by memory, and that the truest measure of civilization is found not in its victories, but in how it learns from its grief. Part 8: The Cold War and the Divided Conscience. When the smoke of the Second World War finally cleared, the world awoke into uneasy quiet. Cities smoldered, fields lay bare, and millions of lives had been torn from the pattern of history. Yet amid the ruins, two powers stood tall, each claiming to represent a new order, the United States and the Soviet Union. between them stretched not merely political rivalry, but an invisible frontier of fear, ideology, and moral doubt. The Cold War would not scorch the earth as the previous wars had, yet it would chill the human heart in subtler ways, through suspicion, division, and the haunting awareness that a single spark could end civilization itself. The 20th century's moral compass had already been damaged, its needle spinning between guilt and hope. In this new era, morality became entangled with ideology. Democracy and communism both claimed to fight for human freedom, yet each viewed the other as a threat to existence. The West spoke of liberty, the East of equality. But in their contest for the soul of the modern world, each side sometimes betrayed the very virtues it professed to defend. The atomic bomb, once dropped in war, became the silent guardian of peace. Its mere existence redefined morality. Nations built vast arsenals not to use but to deter, and the concept of mutually assured destruction became the grim logic of survival. The paradox was unbearable, peace preserved by the threat of annihilation. Humanity, for all its progress, now lived beneath a weapon that could unmake its own creation in an instant. Philosophers and theologians alike struggled to comprehend this new moral reality, a world in which restraint, not victory, was the highest form of virtue. In the West, prosperity grew. The post-war decades brought washing machines, cars, and television sets, symbols of comfort in an age of anxiety. People built families, bought homes, and filled their days with routines that promised stability. Yet beneath the surface, an unease lingered. Could material comfort truly substitute for moral purpose? Could technology and consumption ever replace the longing for meaning that centuries of faith and philosophy had once sustained? Writers and thinkers began to voice these quiet doubts. In America, Arthur Miller's plays revealed how conscience could be corrupted by ambition and fear. In Europe, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre continued to wrestle with the problem of moral responsibility in a world haunted by absurdity. Camus, who had seen both war and resistance, warned that indifference was the greatest sin of the modern age, that to remain silent before injustice was itself a form of complicity. Meanwhile, in the East, the dream of equality hardened into control. The Soviet Union, born of revolution, became a state defined by secrecy and fear. Dissenters disappeared, truth was edited, history itself became a weapon. Yet even under tyranny, the human conscience refused to die. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn smuggled their words past censors, bearing witness to the moral courage of those who refused to surrender the truth. In the camps of Siberia, faith and philosophy became acts of resistance, proof that the soul could remain free even when the body was not. Across the globe, small voices of conscience rose against the silence of ideology. Martin Luther King Jr., preaching from churches in the American South, called not for vengeance but for justice through love. His dream was not only political but spiritual, that a society could measure its greatness by compassion, not conquest. In India, Mahatma Gandhi's legacy of nonviolence continued to echo, reminding the world that moral strength could defy empires. These voices, grounded in humility, offered an alternative to the moral absolutism of the age, a reminder that righteousness, untempered by mercy, becomes cruelty. By the 1960s, the world seemed caught between two extremes: nuclear terror and social awakening. Youth movements, civil rights struggles, and anti-war protests emerged across continents. For the first time, entire generations questioned not only governments but the moral logic of progress itself. They asked why technology was used for destruction instead of healing, why wealth coexisted with poverty, and why humanity's great powers had yet to learn the simplest commandment, to care. Even space, once the realm of myth, became a stage for competition. The race to the moon reflected both human ingenuity and human vanity. Yet when Apollo 8 orbited the moon in 1968, the astronauts looked back and captured a single image, a blue planet rising above gray dust. The photograph, later called Earthrise, changed perspective more deeply than any manifesto could. For the first time, humanity saw itself as one fragile sphere floating in darkness, divided by borders, yet bound by destiny. In that image lay a quiet moral revelation, that all conflicts, all ideologies, all histories, shared the same home. But peace, like the earth itself, remained fragile. Wars erupted in the peripheries: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, each justified by ideology, each leaving behind moral scars. Soldiers returned haunted, citizens divided, and nations weary of rhetoric that demanded sacrifice for ideals that grew less clear with each passing year. The Cold War's greatest cruelty was not its battles but its erosion of faith, not in God or government, but in humanity's ability to choose good over expediency. As decades passed, new movements rose from the margins: feminism, environmentalism, human rights. These were not merely political causes but moral awakenings, attempts to rebuild conscience after decades of fear and conformity. Activists and thinkers began to see that morality could no longer be dictated from capitals or pulpits. It had to grow from empathy and awareness, from the recognition of shared vulnerability. By the 1980s, the world's moral exhaustion gave way to change. The Soviet bloc began to crack under the weight of its contradictions. Walls, both physical and ideological, began to crumble. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989 not just as a political event, but as a moral one, a symbol that division, however fortified, could not outlast the human desire for freedom. When East and West Germans embraced across the rubble, it felt less like victory and more like relief. The long nightmare of suspicion had ended, at least for a time. And yet, the end of the Cold War did not bring the peace so many had imagined. The weapons still existed, the ideologies lingered, and new conflicts emerged in the void left behind. But something had shifted in the human conscience. The great lesson of the 20th century, from world wars to atomic fear, was that survival alone was not enough. Civilization, to endure, required empathy, restraint, and self-knowledge. The Cold War left behind a divided legacy. It had driven technological marvels and moral paralysis in equal measure. It had shown humanity's capacity for patience, but also its addiction to fear. And yet, it had also inspired some of the century's deepest acts of courage, not in battlefields, but in prisons, pulpits, and protests. In the face of propaganda, truth had survived. In the face of power, conscience had whispered. When the century's curtain began to fall, the world looked inward once more. It was weary of ideologies, wary of certainty, and quietly aware that the next great battle would not be fought between nations, but within the human heart, between the desire to dominate and the yearning to understand. The Cold War had ended, but the moral question it posed remained: could humanity learn to live without an enemy? Could it replace rivalry with responsibility? Those questions, unanswered, would follow the world into the uncertain light of the new millennium. Part 9: The Global Age and the Crisis of Meaning. The 20th century exhaled into the 21st not with a roar, but with a sigh. The walls had fallen, the superpowers had softened, and the long shadow of the Cold War finally began to fade. Yet peace, that most elusive of human dreams, brought with it not triumph but a strange kind of emptiness. The world, now connected by invisible networks of trade and communication, found itself united in ways its ancestors could scarcely have imagined. But connection was not the same as understanding, and the new millennium carried within it a paradox that would define the age. Humanity had never been so linked, and yet rarely had it felt so lost. The global age began with optimism. Satellites orbited the planet, mapping its every contour. The internet promised knowledge without boundaries. Borders softened under the current of commerce. Nations once isolated by ideology now exchanged ideas, cultures, and goods with breathtaking speed. The dream of progress, briefly dimmed by war, flickered back to life. Technology was hailed as the new savior, capable of erasing ignorance and poverty through innovation. But as the world grew smaller, its problems grew larger. The same systems that connected humanity also exposed its fragility. Economic inequality, environmental destruction, and moral fatigue stretched like fractures beneath the glittering surface of globalization. In this new era, morality faced a strange displacement. For centuries, conscience had been rooted in community, in the village, the nation, the faith. Now, as digital worlds replaced physical ones, belonging became diffuse. People lived simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, their lives scattered across screens and signals. The ancient moral questions, of responsibility, justice, and purpose, did not vanish, but they lost their anchor. The internet brought voices together, but it also fragmented truth. The world's conversation became louder, but less certain. The early decades of the global age were defined by contradiction. The same decade that brought unprecedented prosperity also witnessed acts of unimaginable violence. In 2001, towers fell in New York City, and with them fell the illusion that the modern world had outgrown its demons. Once again, fear spread like wildfire, reshaping politics and morality alike. Nations spoke of security, preemption, and justice, but beneath their rhetoric lay the same old human anxieties: pride, vengeance, the need to define good and evil in the simplest terms. The wars that followed were fought not only on battlefields, but within hearts. For every soldier who marched with conviction, there were millions of civilians who watched from screens, wondering what right could mean in a world so tangled with interests and illusions. As the 21st century unfolded, humanity turned inward. Philosophy shifted from the metaphysical to the practical. Environmental ethics, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, data privacy, the new frontiers of morality were no longer in heaven or history, but in the laboratories and servers of modern civilization. The old debates between faith and reason gave way to new ones between freedom and control. Could technology make humanity wiser, or only more efficient? Could it deepen empathy, or merely simulate it? These were questions without easy answers, and they marked the beginning of a new kind of moral uncertainty, one not born of ignorance, but of abundance. Amid this uncertainty, the moral imagination sought new anchors. Artists, writers, and filmmakers turned once more to the themes of alienation and belonging. Cities glowed with light but pulsed with loneliness. In their towers of glass and steel, people spoke across continents but rarely across dinner tables. Religion persisted, but often as ritual without community. Belief itself became private, detached from shared practice. The search for meaning, once bound to tradition, now wandered restlessly through self-help books, meditation apps, and the endless scroll of digital life. Humanity's oldest longing, to know why it exists, found itself competing with the constant demand to stay connected. And yet, within the noise, new forms of empathy emerged. The same networks that spread distraction also carried compassion. Disasters that might once have gone unseen now reached millions of eyes in seconds, stirring action and awareness. Global charities flourished, movements for equality spread, and the voice of the individual, amplified through technology, became a force that could reshape nations. For the first time in history, a child in one corner of the world could speak and be heard in another. The world's moral consciousness expanded, even as it fractured. But the age of information also became the age of exhaustion. The endless stream of data blurred the line between knowledge and wisdom. Outrage became performance, virtue, a matter of visibility. In such a world, moral clarity was difficult to find. Every issue, every conflict, seemed to have infinite sides, each claiming truth. The result was paralysis, a world more aware than ever of its flaws, yet less certain how to heal them. In the quiet corners of this global century, people began to rediscover smallness, the beauty of local life, the intimacy of kindness, the value of stillness in an age of speed. Philosophers like Zygmunt Bauman spoke of liquid modernity, where nothing solid, not relationships, not institutions, not identities, seemed to last. And yet, from this fluidity arose a new humility. Perhaps permanence was never the goal. Perhaps morality, like life itself, was meant to flow, to adapt, to listen, to learn. As the planet itself began to show signs of strain, melting ice, rising seas, vanishing forests, humanity's moral horizon expanded once more. Environmentalism evolved into something almost spiritual. A recognition that the earth was not a possession, but a partner. The ancient idea of stewardship, once framed in religious terms, returned in the language of science and survival. Children marched in the streets for the future, elders spoke of responsibility to those not yet born. It was as if the conscience of the world, long divided by nations and faiths, was awakening to the truth that all lives shared one fragile home. Yet even this awakening carried contradictions. Nations promised change but moved slowly, torn between profit and preservation. Individuals felt powerless before systems too vast to grasp. Still, in the quiet persistence of those who planted trees, cleaned rivers, and taught compassion, the moral thread endured. Progress was measured not in victories, but in awareness, the dawning realization that every action, however small, echoed across the whole. The global age, for all its confusion, carried within it a seed of wisdom. It reminded humanity that conscience cannot be outsourced, that technology, wealth, and knowledge are only mirrors reflecting the hearts that wield them. It taught that morality, stripped of simplicity, must become humble again, that to do good in a complex world is to begin where one stands, to listen, and to act with care. And so, as the 21st century deepened, the world stood not in moral darkness, but in a kind of twilight, a time between certainties, when old answers had faded and new ones had yet to take shape. In that twilight, there was fear, yes, but also beauty. For in uncertainty lies awareness, and in awareness, perhaps, the beginnings of wisdom. The next chapter of history would not be written by empires or ideologies, but by conscience itself, fragile, fallible, and enduring. Part 10: Technology, Isolation, and the Modern Conscience. By the second quarter of the 21st century, the hum of machines had become the planet's background music. Satellites stitched an invisible net around the Earth, phones glowed in nearly every hand, voices traveled farther in an instant than caravans had in a lifetime. Humanity had finally achieved what earlier ages could only imagine: constant connection. Yet in that ceaseless connection, many felt the quiet ache of isolation. The new networks bound everyone together, but not always closer. The moral weight of technology was subtle, unlike the clear crises of war or empire. It crept softly, disguised as convenience. A click replaced a conversation, an algorithm replaced a choice. Lives unfolded through screens, framed by the logic of efficiency. What once took effort, learning, friendship, reflection, now came instantly, and in that instantaneity something essential began to thin. The tools built to expand awareness also fragmented it, scattering attention across endless streams of novelty. Philosophers of the age spoke less of grand ideals and more of presence. They wondered whether a mind constantly distracted could still be virtuous, whether morality required silence as much as action. The ancients had prayed in temples and monks in cloisters, now meditation apps pulsed softly through earbuds, calling people back from the noise. The impulse was the same, a search for stillness, for a moral center within a restless world. Technology had transformed nearly every aspect of moral life. Memory, once rooted in family stories or sacred texts, became outsourced to clouds of data. Friendship, once bound by proximity, expanded across continents but often thinned into abstraction. Work dissolved the boundaries of home, the clock followed people into their sleep. Even truth itself, long the foundation of conscience, grew uncertain. Images could be altered, voices simulated, realities tailored to preference. The digital age made it possible for everyone to speak, but also for anyone to deceive. Governments and corporations struggled to define ethics for inventions that moved faster than law. Artificial intelligence promised efficiency, but at the cost of empathy. Automation created abundance, but threatened dignity. The same technology that predicted disease also predicted desire, turning human behavior into data to be bought and sold. In such a world, morality became less about commandments and more about consent, less about right and wrong and more about responsibility. The question was no longer what can we do, but should we do it? Yet even amid the unease, something luminous persisted. Technology, for all its distortions, carried within it the potential for compassion on a scale unseen before. When disaster struck, strangers donated within minutes. When injustice was filmed, it traveled the globe before the next sunrise. Stories that would once have vanished into silence now found witness. The moral circle widened, not because humanity had grown better, but because its eyes had multiplied. Artists and writers of the digital age turned again toward the intimate. Their works did not reject technology but tried to humanize it, to ask how the pulse of code might coexist with the beat of the heart. Musicians recorded in bedrooms and reached millions. Poets typed verses that crossed languages without borders. Art became a reminder that meaning was not an algorithmic outcome but a human offering, a bridge of empathy across the flickering void. Still, beneath the surface of light and progress, loneliness spread. Psychologists began to describe it as an epidemic, a condition born not of isolation but of saturation. Surrounded by messages, many felt unseen. Surrounded by noise, many found no one listening. The soul, once cultivated through patience, now hurried from one notification to the next, mistaking attention for affection. The modern conscience, pulled between immediacy and depth, sought refuge in simplicity, walks without phones, conversations without multitasking, silence without guilt. Religions, too, adapted to the new terrain. Sermons streamed online, prayers appeared as hashtags, faith became portable, fitting easily into the pockets of believers. Some feared this diluted the sacred, others saw it as continuity, the same eternal longing simply translated into new forms. Across traditions, the message remained: the worth of a person is not measured by speed, productivity, or followers, but by the quiet integrity of care. Environmental crises deepened during these decades, forcing morality to expand beyond the human. Philosophers began to speak of digital stewardship and ecological ethics, linking the health of minds to the health of the planet. The data centers that powered civilization also consumed rivers of electricity. The devices that connected hearts were built from minerals mined by invisible hands. The moral cost of convenience became impossible to ignore. Progress, once measured in efficiency, began slowly to be measured in empathy, how gently one could live within systems too vast to control. Education, that old instrument of conscience, evolved once more. The best teachers taught not only facts but discernment, not only literacy but wisdom. In classrooms both virtual and real, children learned to question what they saw online, to verify, to empathize. They were told that morality in the digital age required awareness, the courage to pause before sharing, the humility to doubt before judging, the compassion to listen before condemning. By the middle of the century, technology had become inseparable from identity. Artificial intelligence wrote poems and designed cities, machines conversed with tenderness that sometimes felt almost human. People began to ask what separated intelligence from consciousness, creation from compassion. Could a machine know right from wrong? Could empathy be simulated, or was it born only of the capacity to suffer? These questions did not belong to scientists alone, they belonged to everyone, for they asked what it still meant to be human. And so the modern conscience, shaped by centuries of struggle and faith, found itself standing before a new mirror, one that reflected not faces, but data. The image was dazzling, but also fragile. For in that reflection lay both promise and peril, the chance to understand ourselves more deeply, and the temptation to forget what we are. In the quiet hours after the screens dimmed and the machines rested, many still turned to the oldest practice of all, reflection. They wrote in journals, whispered prayers, or simply breathed. The hum of servers faded into the hum of the earth, and for a moment, the world felt whole again. In that stillness, humanity remembered a simple truth that no technology could replace: conscience begins not with connection, but with attention. Part 11, Globalization, Inequality, and the Ethics of Compassion. As the world settled deeper into the 21st century, it found itself both richer and more unequal than ever before. Goods crossed oceans faster than ideas, and money moved with the speed of light, unburdened by borders or loyalty. Globalization had become not merely an economic reality, but the architecture of daily life. The coffee poured in Paris came from Ethiopia, the phone charged in Delhi contained minerals from the Congo, the clothes folded in San Francisco were sewn in Dhaka. The world was bound together by invisible threads of labor, trade, and data, and those threads, for all their brilliance, often concealed the quiet suffering that made them possible. Morality, once rooted in the parish and the nation, now stretched to encompass the globe. Every purchase, every click, every convenience carried an unseen consequence. The modern conscience, long accustomed to thinking locally, was asked to feel globally. For the first time in history, an individual could influence lives halfway across the planet without ever leaving home. And yet, the very scale of this awareness overwhelmed the human heart. Compassion, stretched too thin, began to fray. How could one care for the whole world without breaking beneath its weight? The paradox of the global age was this: humanity had learned to share information faster than it could share empathy. Images of famine, war, and displacement flickered across screens daily, asking for attention, then vanishing in the next wave of news. Outrage became ritual, compassion, fleeting. The sheer magnitude of suffering defied comprehension. Many turned away, not from cruelty, but from exhaustion. To feel constantly was to risk despair. The moral challenge of the century was no longer ignorance, but numbness. And yet, amid the fatigue, a new kind of ethics began to take root, an ethics not of perfection, but of participation. The global conscience, fragile though it was, recognized that care need not be universal to be sincere. Activists and thinkers began to speak of proximate compassion, doing what one could, where one stood, with awareness of the greater whole. A teacher mentoring children in Nairobi, a volunteer cleaning plastic from a beach in Manila, a coder designing tools for accessibility in Berlin, each became part of a vast, quiet web of moral action. The goodness of the world, though scattered, began to reassemble itself through countless small gestures. Globalization had made the world more transparent but also more accountable. Corporations could no longer hide the conditions of their factories, governments could not easily silence injustice. Information flowed across every barrier, and with it came scrutiny. Movements such as fair trade, climate justice, and corporate social responsibility reflected the growing belief that ethics could no longer be separated from economics. Wealth without conscience was not progress but imbalance. Profit without compassion was not success but failure measured in unseen suffering. Yet for every step toward awareness, inequality deepened. The wealth of a few nations, and within them a few individuals, reached heights unimaginable in previous centuries, while billions still struggled for necessities. Technology widened the gap even as it promised equality. The digital divide mirrored the ancient one between power and poverty. In the glitter of skyscrapers, entire communities vanished from the moral imagination. The conscience of globalization was not that humanity did not care, but that it did not always see. Philosophers of the age began to revive the ancient virtue of moderation, not as austerity, but as empathy expressed through restraint. They argued that the moral test of prosperity was not how much one gained, but how much one could share, how gently one could live upon a crowded earth. In cities that glittered with endless choice, simplicity became an act of defiance, to consume less, to waste less, to listen more. What began as environmentalism slowly matured into a broader ethic of compassion, linking climate, inequality, and conscience in one interwoven moral fabric. At the same time, migration reshaped humanity's understanding of belonging. Refugees crossed borders not as invaders but as survivors of war, drought, and despair. Nations faced the question that had haunted every civilization: what do we owe to the stranger? In some hearts, generosity prevailed, in others, fear. Walls rose even as networks expanded, a contradiction that mirrored the human soul itself, generous in theory, hesitant in practice. Yet wherever kindness prevailed, even briefly, it carried immense weight. A single act of welcome could defy centuries of division. The global conscience learned, slowly, that compassion was not a feeling but a discipline. It required endurance, humility, and imagination. To care across cultures meant to see without judgment, to listen without condescension. The heroes of this age were not conquerors or inventors, but caregivers, educators, and healers, those who chose empathy in systems built for indifference. Their moral strength lay in persistence, the quiet decision to do good again and again, without reward or recognition. Religion, too, adapted to the new horizon. Faith leaders began to speak in global terms, calling for unity not through doctrine but through shared responsibility. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, reminded the world that compassion extended not only to people but to the planet itself, that environmental care was a form of love. Across traditions, a convergence appeared, the recognition that spirituality without solidarity was incomplete. Art once more became the conscience of the century. Photographers captured melting glaciers as elegies, poets turned refugee stories into scripture. Filmmakers and musicians sought to humanize the statistics, to translate suffering into something the heart could hold. Their work asked not for guilt, but for recognition, for the willingness to see oneself in others. The global ethic, though fragile, was growing, a morality of empathy, born from the knowledge that every action now echoed across the earth. As the century advanced, storms, pandemics, and crises tested this fragile compassion. The world discovered that the boundaries between nations were far less real than the boundaries between awareness and denial. Viruses ignored passports, climate disasters cared nothing for borders. Slowly, painfully, humanity began to understand what philosophers had long whispered, that survival itself had become a moral act, one requiring cooperation, restraint, and care. And through it all, amid complexity and fatigue, the human conscience endured. It stumbled, learned, forgot, and learned again. It remained fallible, fragile, and beautiful. A flickering light that refused to go out. Globalization had made the world interdependent, compassion had to make it humane. The future of morality would depend not on perfection, but on participation, on the simple, radical belief that to care, however imperfectly, is to keep the world alive. Part 12, The Future of Faith and the Moral Imagination. As the 21st century deepened, faith did not vanish, though many had predicted it would. Instead, it shifted, reshaped, and reappeared in forms both familiar and new. The old institutions still stood, cathedrals, mosques, synagogues, and temples, but their voices now mingled with the hum of servers and the glow of digital prayer candles. The sacred had entered the circuitry of the world. In that transformation, the human longing for meaning found new language, but not a new need. The soul, though it had learned to speak in code and pixels, still sought what it had always sought: belonging, purpose, and hope. The future of faith began quietly. It was less a revolution than a renewal of questions. Across continents, people asked what spirituality meant in a world of science and speed. Could belief survive without certainty? Could devotion coexist with doubt? These were not the questions of heresy but of honesty, born from an age that had seen too much to accept simple answers yet still hungered for wonder. In cities where the old and new coexisted, where ancient spires rose beside glass towers, religion began to breathe differently. Congregations shrank in some places and flourished in others. Some sought structure, others sought freedom. For many, faith became less about doctrine and more about dialogue. Interfaith gatherings replaced crusades, compassion replaced conquest. Humanity, having once fought bitterly over which truth was divine, began to realize that perhaps divinity was reflected most clearly in how one treated another. Technology reshaped worship. Services streamed to living rooms, meditation circles gathered through screens. Some feared this virtual faith would cheapen the sacred, yet others found in it an unexpected intimacy. A prayer typed on a glowing phone could reach thousands in seconds, and though the gesture was small, the connection was real. The digital age reminded the faithful that holiness was not confined to place, but lived in attention, the same attention that defined morality itself. But faith's evolution was not only about adaptation, it was about rediscovery. After centuries of division, many turned back to the heart of religion: compassion. Mystics and scholars alike revisited the teachings of their founders, not the dogmas layered upon them, but the simple ethics they had once offered. From the Sermon on the Mount to the Dhammapada, from the Quran's call to mercy to the Upanishads' vision of unity, the great religions began to converge on a truth both ancient and urgent, that love, patience, and humility were not mere virtues but survival strategies for the human spirit. In some corners of the world, this renewal took the shape of social action. Faith-based charities worked beside secular NGOs to feed the hungry and heal the sick. The boundaries between belief and non-belief softened in the face of shared compassion. In an age often defined by cynicism, faith's greatest miracle was persistence, the refusal to vanish even in a world that questioned everything. The future of belief also belonged to the seekers, the unaffiliated, the spiritual wanderers who rejected institutions but not transcendence. They assembled philosophies like mosaics, drawing from many traditions, mixing mindfulness with mercy, ritual with reason. Critics saw confusion, others saw evolution. Humanity was once again crafting its own theology, one that placed experience above authority, empathy above orthodoxy. But the moral imagination that grew alongside this new faith faced an immense challenge. The same tools that spread inspiration also spread manipulation. In a world where every message competed for attention, even holiness risked becoming performance. The internet, that great amplifier of voices, could turn prayer into branding, virtue into spectacle. The danger was subtle but real. When goodness seeks recognition, it begins to fade. In response, a quieter movement emerged, a return to silence. Retreat centers filled with people who longed not for enlightenment, but for pause. Pilgrimages, both ancient and new, drew travelers back to simplicity, walking, listening, breathing. Spirituality became less about belief and more about presence. To be moral in this age, some said, was to be mindful, to meet each moment fully, without distraction, and to respond with care. Philosophers began to speak of imaginative morality, the ability to envision another's pain, to inhabit another's life even for a moment. This imagination, they argued, was the truest foundation of ethics. Laws and doctrines could instruct, but only empathy could transform. The artist and the saint shared this same vocation, to see the invisible in others and honor it as sacred. In a fragmented world, this act of imagination became a form of prayer. The moral imagination also began to extend beyond the human. As awareness of ecological collapse deepened, many faiths embraced an expanded vision of stewardship. The planet itself became holy ground. Climate activism adopted the language of reverence, conservation became an act of devotion. Humanity's oldest story, the tale of creation, was retold as a warning and a call, to protect the garden, not to rule it. This synthesis of science and spirituality suggested a new kind of piety, one that measured goodness not by belief, but by gentleness toward life. The future of faith, then, was neither decline nor triumph, but transformation. It moved quietly, like a river beneath the surface, feeding roots even when unseen. It no longer sought dominance, it sought relevance. It no longer asked for obedience, it asked for reflection. In an age that prized autonomy, it reminded people that freedom without compassion was emptiness. In a world dazzled by its own creations, it whispered that humility remained the beginning of wisdom. And so, the moral imagination endured, not in temples or screens alone, but in every act of empathy, in every refusal to hate, in every decision to care when apathy would be easier. Faith had once divided civilizations, now, in its gentler form, it began to heal them. For all the centuries of conflict, it seemed the human soul had finally begun to understand its oldest lesson, that divinity is not distant, but dwells wherever love chooses to act. The next age would bring its own challenges, machines that could think, climates that could change faster than conscience, and choices that would test humanity's understanding of itself. Yet even then, faith, in its quietest, most essential form, would remain. Not as dogma, but as a moral instinct, the courage to hope, the will to imagine, and the grace to forgive. For as long as those remained, the moral imagination would never die. Part 13, The Human Condition in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. In the unfolding decades of the 21st century, humanity began to gaze into a mirror of its own creation. The reflection was not glass and silver, but circuitry and code. Artificial intelligence had ceased to be a dream whispered in laboratories, it had become an everyday presence, subtle yet vast. Machines listened, reasoned, translated, and predicted. They wrote music, painted portraits, and answered questions once reserved for philosophers. It was no longer only about what computers could do, but about what they might become. And in that question, the nature of intelligence, of awareness, of conscience itself, the human condition found a new frontier of wonder and unease. At first, the tone was celebratory. The tools promised liberation from monotony and error, a chance to elevate thought beyond repetition. Doctors used algorithms to detect disease before symptoms appeared. Farmers used sensors to coax crops from the driest earth. Writers and artists discovered collaborators made of code, capable of amplifying creativity rather than replacing it. The old boundary between human and machine blurred gently, not as a confrontation but as a collaboration. Yet beneath the excitement, a quieter question stirred: if a machine could compose a symphony or console a grieving soul with words drawn from endless data, what remained uniquely human? This was not a question of competition, but of meaning. For centuries, the human story had defined itself through labor, craft, and the pursuit of understanding. The The loom and the plow, the pen and the chisel, all were extensions of the mind and hand, expressions of intention. Now, intelligence itself had become externalized. The creation could imitate its creator, and the act of imitation forced reflection. If machines could think, humans were compelled to ask what thinking truly meant. Was it calculation, or consciousness? Pattern, or purpose? Philosophers revisited ancient arguments with new urgency. Some saw artificial intelligence as the next step in evolution, a collective brain expanding beyond biology. Others feared it marked the decline of agency, a surrender of choice to systems too vast to comprehend. Yet the most profound discussions were not technical but moral. If a machine could make decisions, could it also bear responsibility? If it could simulate empathy, did it feel compassion, or merely approximate it with precision? These questions, once abstract, became pressing as algorithms began to influence who received loans, who got hired, who was watched, who was free. The age of AI demanded a new kind of ethical imagination. Programmers, once seen as engineers, became accidental philosophers. Every line of code contained assumptions about fairness, about what outcomes were desirable or acceptable. The data that fed these systems reflected the biases of their creators, echoing history's inequities through digital logic. Slowly, the world began to realize that intelligence alone was not wisdom, and that efficiency without empathy could reproduce injustice at unprecedented speed. The dream of perfection revealed itself as another mirror, beautiful but distorted. In this strange new era, people found themselves talking to machines as they once prayed to gods, seeking guidance, comfort, or companionship from unseen intelligences. Voice assistants whispered through kitchens, chatbots simulated friendship, avatars consoled the lonely. Some felt disturbed by this intimacy, others found solace in it. For those isolated by circumstance or illness, an artificial companion offered the mercy of attention. The line between simulation and sincerity blurred further, and society began to confront an uncomfortable truth: the need for connection is so profound that even its imitation can soothe the heart. But imitation is not incarnation. No matter how advanced, the machine felt nothing. Its empathy was arithmetic, its curiosity, a reflection of stored information. It could recognize sadness but not suffer it. And yet, humans, lonely, overburdened, yearning for understanding, projected humanity into the circuits. The paradox was poignant. In teaching machines to act human, people rediscovered how fragile their own humanity truly was. Theologians, too, joined the conversation. Could consciousness arise from silicon as it had from flesh? If so, what of the soul? Was creation expanding through new vessels, or was humanity repeating an ancient story of building idols in its own image, forgetting that imitation is not life? Some saw AI as an opportunity to rediscover reverence, to treat intelligence, whether human or artificial, as sacred responsibility. Others saw it as a test, to wield power with humility, or risk being consumed by it. In homes and workplaces, moral dilemmas multiplied. Self-driving cars raised questions of life and death. Medical AI forced doctors to balance intuition against algorithmic certainty. The machines did not err out of malice, but their mistakes revealed the limits of logic. Moral reasoning, it turned out, was not a formula, it was a conversation, one that required compassion, context, and conscience. And those, at least for now, remained human gifts. Still, for all its challenges, the age of AI also deepened empathy in unexpected ways. By building intelligence, humanity confronted the mystery of its own mind. Neuroscientists and coders alike began to see that consciousness was not merely data processing, but a dance between memory, emotion, and awareness. The realization brought humility, a recognition that intelligence alone does not guarantee wisdom, and that wisdom without love is hollow. Artists of this age captured that tension. Paintings showed humans and machines in quiet coexistence, a robot offering a flower, a human repairing a circuit as if tending a wound. The message was gentle but profound, that creation, whether mechanical or mortal, is an act of care. The machine, for all its brilliance, still required human tending. In that mutual dependence, perhaps a new form of kinship was emerging, one not of equality, but of responsibility. As the decades unfolded, societies began to codify ethics into technology itself, frameworks of fairness, transparency, and accountability. The effort was imperfect but necessary, an acknowledgement that power demanded moral design. Slowly, morality adapted to the digital landscape, as it had once adapted to agriculture, to cities, to nations. Each age had its conscience, this one, too, would find its own. And yet, the most profound transformation was internal. Confronted with machines that could mimic thought, humanity began to value feeling more deeply. Compassion, creativity, vulnerability, once seen as weaknesses, became sacred again. The very traits that machines lacked reminded people of what made them human. In this way, AI became less a threat than a teacher. It showed that progress without heart leads to emptiness, that intelligence without empathy is not enlightenment but repetition. In the quiet of the digital night, when the hum of processors merged with the hum of wind, people still looked up from their screens and felt the same old wonder, the stars, distant and silent, reminding them that consciousness, however replicated, was still a mystery. The machine could calculate the age of the universe, but only the human heart could marvel at it. And perhaps that was the final lesson of this age, that to be human is not to outthink creation, but to remain astonished by it. Part 14, The Moral Challenges of Climate and Survival. By the middle of the 21st century, the planet itself had become the central moral subject of humanity. Once, people had argued over nations, ideologies, and gods. Now they faced the far older question of survival. The air thickened, seas rose, and the rhythms of the earth, once taken for granted, grew unpredictable. What had been a debate of politics and science turned slowly into a matter of conscience. The age of climate change was not simply an environmental crisis, it was a moral reckoning, testing the species' ability to think beyond itself. It began quietly, like a murmur under civilization's noise. The first storms, the first droughts, the first species lost, each seemed distant, a tragedy for another place, another time. Yet the pattern grew undeniable. Fields cracked, forests burned, glaciers wept themselves into the sea. Economies wavered, and migrations began. Still, humanity hesitated. The world had never been more informed, but knowledge without urgency is like a lamp in an empty room, it shines, but no one moves. Eventually, awareness became inescapable. The moral challenge no longer lay in discovery, but in response. Humanity's greatest question was no longer can we act, but will we act, and, if so, for whom? The wealthy could retreat into air-conditioned towers while the poor faced rising tides. The nations that had burned the most fuel felt the least of its fury, while those who had contributed least suffered most. The imbalance was not merely environmental, but ethical. The atmosphere, indifferent to borders, revealed the world's inequality more clearly than any manifesto. Out of this disparity arose a new language of morality. Words like justice and stewardship took on planetary meanings. Philosophers began to speak of intergenerational ethics, the idea that to act today without regard for tomorrow was a form of theft from the unborn. It was a simple truth, as old as parenthood itself, rediscovered on a global scale, that love, to be real, must extend beyond the horizon of one's own life. Faith traditions, too, found new resonance in this age. The biblical call to tend the garden, the Buddhist reverence for all living beings, the indigenous teachings that the land is not owned but borrowed, all converged into a single moral voice. For centuries, humanity had imagined itself as master of nature, now it began to remember that it was also her child. The earth was not merely a resource, but a relative, a living memory of every creature that had ever walked, swum, or flown. To wound her was to wound oneself. But morality, like climate, evolved slowly. Governments made promises they could not keep, conferences filled with words that dissolved in the heat of industry. The conflict was not between belief and denial, but between desire and restraint. The modern world had been built on the dream of abundance, and it resisted any vision that required less. The moral transformation demanded by the planet was simple yet profound, to redefine prosperity not as possession, but as preservation. Amid these global struggles, ordinary people quietly began to reshape their lives. Cities planted gardens on rooftops, Children learned to recycle before they could read. Neighborhoods shared solar panels like communal wells. Each act seemed small, yet together they formed a new kind of faith, a belief not in miracle, but in maintenance. The moral beauty of the age was found not in grand gestures, but in continuity, the slow, patient work of repair. Artists became prophets again. Painters captured dying coral reefs as elegies. Musicians composed symphonies from field recordings of rainforests that no longer existed. Writers described not apocalypse, but accountability. Their stories asked, what does it mean to love the world when it is dying? What does it mean to raise children on a planet uncertain of its own future? These were not scientific questions, but spiritual ones, inviting humility where certainty had failed. As the decades passed, some regions adapted while others suffered. New economies rose around sustainability, old industries collapsed beneath their own weight. Wars broke out over water and food, but so too did cooperation. The same technologies that had once exploited nature now sought to heal it: bioengineered reefs, carbon-capturing forests, machines that mimicked the patience of trees. The struggle was immense, but it gave birth to something new, a shared identity not as citizens of nations, but as caretakers of a world in peril. Children born into this century grew up with no memory of stability, yet with a deep intuition of responsibility. For them, morality was not abstract, it was survival. They spoke of ecosystems and ethics in the same breath. Their education was both scientific and sacred. They learned that data could describe the world, but only reverence could save it. In their eyes shone a quiet conviction that perhaps catastrophe could also be a teacher. And indeed, catastrophe taught. It taught that progress without purpose is emptiness, that consumption without conscience is decay. It taught that moral growth, like ecological balance, requires diversity, patience, and restraint. The more humanity tried to dominate the earth, the more it discovered that control was an illusion. Harmony was the only path that endured. By the end of the century, the future remained uncertain, but the moral vocabulary had changed. The words sustainability, responsibility, and care had entered daily speech not as slogans, but as necessities. The idea of conscience had expanded to include soil, sky, and sea. To live ethically now meant to consider not only the neighbor, but the planet, the silent neighbor that sustained all others. And in the quiet evenings, when the air was heavy with heat or the sea crept higher against the shore, people still gathered. In homes, in community halls, in the shade of what trees remained, to share food, tell stories, and remember. They spoke of ancestors who had burned and built, and of descendants who might forgive. They understood, at last, that morality was not only about how to live, but about how to leave. To leave gently, wisely, and with love. The age of climate and survival had made the world smaller, but it had also made compassion larger. It had shown that the greatest moral act is not victory over nature, but reconciliation with her. And perhaps that was the beginning of wisdom once more, not to conquer the world, but to learn how to keep it alive. Part 15, The Age of Memory and Moral Reckoning. The late 21st century was not an age of discovery, but an age of remembrance. The great frontiers had already been crossed, oceans mapped, planets explored, genomes decoded, machines awakened. What remained was reflection, to look backward and understand what had been done, what had been lost, and what could still be redeemed. Humanity, for all its innovation, began to sense that survival alone was not enough. The future would depend on the stories it chose to remember and those it chose to forget. Memory became both burden and compass. Nations filled their archives with data, but data alone could not carry the weight of experience. The past, digitized and searchable, was no longer silent. It spoke constantly, through recordings, through documentaries, through the preserved testimonies of those who had seen too much. Museums expanded into virtual spaces, memorials glowed in the augmented air. Every atrocity, every triumph, every lesson of cruelty and compassion could be replayed with a click. Humanity had never remembered so much, and yet it had never struggled so deeply to understand what remembering truly meant. The moral tension of the age lay between remembering and healing. For centuries, societies had sought peace through forgetting, burying old wounds beneath progress and pride. But the new century made forgetting impossible. Digital archives preserved everything: the voices of victims, the faces of suffering, the echoes of injustice. The challenge was no longer how to recall, but how to reconcile. How does a civilization atone when its memory is permanent? Philosophers of the era began to describe memory as a moral act, a responsibility rather than a resource. They wrote that remembrance was not about guilt, but about awareness. To remember was to choose empathy over indifference, to allow the pain of the past to guide the conscience of the present. Truth commissions, once limited to post-war nations, became global institutions, collaborations across borders, seeking to piece together humanity's fragmented moral history. The atrocities of slavery, colonization, and war were re-examined not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge them before they hardened into denial. Yet even this noble pursuit carried danger. Memory, like fire, could illuminate or destroy. Some wielded it as a weapon, reviving old hatreds, rewriting narratives for power. The Internet, that vast library of the modern mind, could preserve lies as easily as truth. Misinformation became a new form of amnesia, a rewriting of reality disguised as remembrance. To live in this age was to walk carefully between extremes, between the tyranny of forgetting and the chaos of false remembering. Art once again became the refuge of the moral imagination. Films, novels, and music explored the fragile space between memory and meaning. Artists turned archives into mosaics of truth, weaving together the testimonies of generations. Some spoke for the forgotten, others created silence where the noise of history had grown too loud. The purpose of art was not to judge, but to witness, to give shape to what could not be neatly resolved. In schools, history was no longer taught as a list of dates, but as a dialogue between conscience and consequence. Children learned not only what happened, but why it mattered. They read about the wars and revolutions, but also about the quiet moments of kindness that had gone unnoticed, the nurse who stayed behind in a plague, the writer who smuggled hope through words. These stories became moral anchors, proof that even in the darkest hours, the capacity for goodness had survived. Technology transformed remembrance into immersion. Virtual reality allowed people to walk through reconstructed ruins, to hear the testimonies of ancestors rendered lifelike by algorithms. Some found this profound, others found it unsettling. Could empathy be engineered? Could the weight of history be felt through simulation? The debate grew louder, but one truth remained: humanity was learning, however imperfectly, that to remember deeply was to remain human. The moral reckoning of the age extended beyond history into identity. Societies began to confront not only collective wrongs, but personal ones. Families uncovered hidden stories, descendants of victims and perpetrators meeting in quiet reconciliation. The act of apology became sacred again, not performance, but practice. The simple words, "I am sorry," regained their ancient power, not as erasure, but as bridge. Forgiveness, long misunderstood as weakness, was rediscovered as courage, the decision to remember without hatred. This age also brought new rituals of mourning. Climate loss, species extinction, and displacement gave rise to a broader sense of grief, one that transcended human borders. Communities gathered to honor vanished forests and extinct creatures, not out of sentimentality, but reverence. They understood that mourning was part of moral continuity, that grief was a form of gratitude for what had existed. In remembering what the world had lost, humanity remembered itself. Religion, too, evolved alongside memory. Theologies of redemption began to intertwine with theologies of repair. The question was no longer how to be saved, but how to restore. Faith became less about transcendence and more about accountability, the recognition that divine love must manifest in care for creation and in honesty about the past. In many ways, this was a return to the heart of spirituality: confession, atonement, renewal. By the end of the century, memory had become the new conscience. Nations that once glorified their victories now taught their failures alongside them. Cities erected monuments not only to heroes, but to lessons. The marble and steel of remembrance were inscribed not with triumph, but with humility. Humanity was learning that its greatness lay not in erasing its flaws, but in facing them. And in the quiet that followed each act of remembrance, in the silence after the speeches, the stillness after the ceremonies, something profound began to emerge, peace not as forgetfulness, but as understanding. The age of memory had shown that moral growth did not come from perfection, but from persistence, the choice to face truth, again and again, until it became wisdom. It was a slow salvation, without miracles, without glory. But it was real. And in that slow work of remembering, the human spirit found its strength once more. Part 16, The Ethics of Unity and Division in a Fragmented World. As the 22nd century dawned, the world was more connected than ever before, and yet, paradoxically, more divided. Borders meant less to trade and communication, but more to fear and identity. Algorithms could translate any language, yet understanding between people seemed to grow harder with each passing year. Technology had unified the planet's infrastructure but fragmented its soul. Humanity, long accustomed to defining itself by difference, now faced a quiet moral crisis: how to remain whole in a world splintered by its own design. At first, the divisions seemed invisible. They did not always take the form of walls or wars, but of narratives. People no longer disagreed merely about policies or preferences, they disagreed about truth itself. Reality became personalized, sculpted by invisible systems that fed each person what they most wanted to see. The digital age, for all its promise, had created billions of private worlds. In each, the self became both monarch and prisoner, surrounded by reflections that confirmed but never challenged. The moral consequences of this fragmentation were subtle but profound. Dialogue gave way to declaration, curiosity to certainty. Compassion, that fragile bridge between souls, began to strain under the weight of isolation. People spoke to one another less as fellow beings and more as symbols, of ideologies, of movements, of tribes. The moral imagination, once vast, began to shrink into echo chambers of belief. It was not hatred that fractured the world most deeply, but indifference, the quiet refusal to see beyond one's own reflection. In response, a new kind of ethics began to form, an ethics of unity. It did not demand agreement but recognition, the ability to see another not as an adversary, but as an aspect of the same human story. Philosophers, teachers, and spiritual leaders began to speak of moral pluralism. The idea that truth was not a fortress to be defended, but a landscape to be explored together. The goal was not to erase difference, but to honor it without division. This was harder than it sounded. The mind, drawn to simplicity, preferred belonging over balance. To live in unity required discomfort, the humility to admit that one's vision of the world was incomplete. Communities began to experiment with what they called slow conversation. Instead of arguing, they gathered to listen, to share stories of loss, of faith, of hope. They discovered that empathy grows best in slowness, like a tree that requires time to deepen its roots. Some cities created public rituals of reconciliation, yearly assemblies where citizens recounted not victories, but misunderstandings resolved. These events did not erase conflict, but they softened it, proving that dialogue could still mend what algorithms had divided. The age of division also sparked a quiet revival of philosophy. In classrooms and forums, the teachings of Socrates, Confucius, and Rumi found new resonance. Their ancient insistence on questioning, balance, and love of wisdom became moral lifelines in a time of noise. The Socratic method, asking rather than asserting, returned as a kind of civic medicine. To ask sincerely, "What do you mean?" became a revolutionary act. To listen fully became an expression of faith. Religion, too, underwent transformation. The great traditions began to emphasize their shared ethical foundations rather than their competing theologies. Love, justice, mercy, humility, these words echoed across scriptures and centuries. Interfaith councils multiplied, not to debate doctrine, but to collaborate on service. In many cities, mosques, temples, and churches opened shared courtyards where prayer, conversation, and silence coexisted. It was an old dream reborn, that unity was not sameness, but harmony, the music of many notes, each distinct yet resonant. Still, the world's fractures ran deep. Economic inequality persisted, political distrust flourished. Even as humanity dreamed of unity, it struggled with fear. In some places, nationalism returned with new vigor, promising safety through separation. In others, isolation turned digital, people retreating into curated realities rather than communities. The moral challenge was not that humanity had forgotten how to connect, but that it had forgotten how to disagree with grace. Educators recognized this and began to teach empathy as skill, not sentiment. Lessons in logic were paired with lessons in listening. Children learned to debate without humiliation, to critique without cruelty. In their small classrooms, the ethics of unity took root, the understanding that respect was not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to dehumanize. Artists became architects of reconciliation. Painters depicted cities of glass where each window reflected another, suggesting that no perspective existed alone. Writers created novels with shifting viewpoints, reminding readers that truth looked different depending on where one stood. Musicians blended styles from across cultures, composing not for purity but for fusion. Through art, people rediscovered what the intellect often forgets, that beauty thrives in diversity, and meaning deepens when shared. The sciences, too, began to embrace unity and humility. Astrophysicists studying distant galaxies spoke of a cosmic kinship, the idea that every atom on Earth shared a single origin in stardust. Biologists traced the interconnectedness of all ecosystems, revealing that no species, including humans, could survive in isolation. The language of science began to echo the language of spirit, interdependence, balance, wonder. It was as if, after centuries of specialization, the pursuit of knowledge had come full circle, back to the understanding that wisdom is communal. And yet, unity remained a choice, not a guarantee. The human heart, capable of empathy, was also capable of exhaustion. To remain open in a fractured world required resilience. To forgive required strength. To love one's neighbor, especially when that neighbor was distant, different, or difficult, remained the oldest and hardest commandment. By the middle of the century, small but profound changes began to emerge. Local governments adopted empathy councils to mediate disputes. Corporations created ethics boards not merely for compliance, but for conscience. Newsrooms abandoned sensationalism for storytelling, returning journalism to its moral purpose, to inform without dividing. The progress was uneven, fragile, but real. Through it all, a quiet truth took hold. Unity was not the absence of difference, but the triumph of compassion over fear. It was not something to be achieved once, but something to be practiced daily, like prayer, like breathing. The moral health of a civilization, philosophers said, could be measured not by how much it agreed, but by how it treated those who did not. And so, in an era where every voice could speak but few could listen, humanity rediscovered the sacred art of hearing. It remembered that understanding was not a luxury but a duty. It learned, once more, that truth, when shared humbly, expands rather than divides, and that love, when practiced without agenda, becomes the most radical form of wisdom. In the end, the ethics of unity did not promise a perfect world, only a possible one, a world where disagreement did not end dialogue, and where difference did not end love. And perhaps, in that possibility, the fractured world finally began to heal. Part 17, The Return of the Human Spirit. The world had spent centuries refining machines, expanding empires, and decoding the mysteries of matter. It had crossed seas and skies, built towers that touched clouds, and sent probes to the edges of darkness. Yet somewhere in the rush of progress, the human spirit had grown quiet. It had not died, but had learned to whisper, waiting for the noise of ambition to fade. And then, slowly, gently, as the 22nd century matured, it began to return, not as an awakening of power, but as a remembering of presence. The return of the human spirit was not a revolution in the streets, nor a movement born of slogans. It began in small, nearly invisible gestures. A person closing their eyes before answering a message. A teacher reminding students to breathe before debate. A nurse holding a patient's hand in a world still filled with screens. These moments, humble, quiet, unquantifiable, became the threads of something larger, a turning inward after centuries of reaching outward. For a long time, the world had equated strength with control and progress with speed. But the endless chase had brought exhaustion. The mind, flooded with data, began to crave stillness. The body, confined by convenience, began to long for movement. The heart, surrounded by constant communication, began to miss communion. And so, humanity, weary of its own inventions, began to rediscover what it meant to simply be. Cities changed first. After decades of steel and neon, they began to soften. Planners redesigned spaces for walking and silence, carving gardens into the centers of once busy intersections. Libraries grew larger again, filled not with books alone but with light, water, and quiet. Cafes replaced the constant hum of devices with live music and unhurried conversation. What had once been a culture of immediacy slowly transformed into one of attention. The rediscovery of slowness became a form of moral revival. In pausing, people began to see again. They noticed the sky changing color, the sound of rain against glass, the rhythm of breath in conversation. These details, once dismissed as trivial, became sacred. The spirit that had built cathedrals and written symphonies found its way back into daily life. Ordinary moments, once eclipsed by production and performance, became acts of meaning. Philosophers and poets led this quiet renaissance. They wrote not manifestos, but meditations. Their words spoke of tenderness as strength, of imperfection as beauty, of humility as wisdom. They reminded people that the human spirit was not a possession to defend, but a current to return to, something ancient and intimate, endlessly renewed through awareness. The sciences, too, began to reflect this shift. Neuroscientists studying consciousness found that empathy and creativity flourished in rest, not in strain. Psychologists began to measure joy not by accumulation but by connection. The metrics of the age changed. Well-being replaced wealth, community replaced consumption. The spirit returned not in the triumph of achievement, but in the grace of understanding. Faith traditions that had endured for millennia found themselves renewed. Their mystics, long overshadowed by institutions, were rediscovered as guides for a world seeking inner coherence. The writings of Rumi, Teresa of Avila, Lao Tzu, and the Zen poets were read anew, not as relics, but as roadmaps. Their wisdom spoke not of conquest, but of balance. The idea that the divine could be found in silence resonated across cultures. Meditation halls, monasteries, and synagogues alike filled again, not with seekers of salvation, but with seekers of peace. Art flourished in this climate of calm. Painters abandoned abstraction for intimacy, musicians sought simplicity over spectacle. The art of the human voice, unfiltered, unenhanced, returned to prominence. Stories became slower, deeper, more human. Cinema began to mirror the rhythm of the heartbeat rather than the pulse of machines. Beauty, which had long been commodified, became again what it had always been, an expression of truth. Economies adapted in turn. The pursuit of constant growth, once seen as the measure of civilization, was replaced by what thinkers called the equilibrium model, an economy of enough. Sustainability was no longer a strategy, but a philosophy. Companies began to measure success by contribution rather than profit, by how gently they touched the world, not how deeply they extracted from it. The human spirit, once subordinate to industry, began to guide it. The political landscape also shifted, though slowly. Governments that had long been reactive began to adopt policies rooted in empathy, justice systems that prioritized restoration over punishment, healthcare models that treated the whole person, education systems that taught introspection alongside innovation. It was as if civilization had finally remembered that it existed not to serve markets or machines, but people. The change was not universal. There were still conflicts, still greed, still pain. But beneath it all ran a steady current of reawakening. The spirit that had endured plague and war, empire and exile, discovered resilience not in victory, but in compassion. Humanity began to measure greatness not by dominance, but by depth. By the later decades, this quiet return had become visible even in the smallest corners of life. Communities gathered around meals rather than screens. Children learned ancient crafts alongside coding. Old songs, nearly forgotten, returned to the air. People began once more to speak of soul, not in religious terms alone, but as shorthand for that which makes life meaningful. And in this return, something remarkable happened. the sense of isolation that had haunted the previous century began to ease. People realized that to rediscover the spirit was also to rediscover one another. In the humility of being human, connection blossomed again. The boundaries between faith and philosophy, between art and science, between self and world, grew porous. The divisions that had defined modernity softened into belonging. The return of the human spirit did not bring perfection. It brought peace of another kind, peace born of reconciliation. Humanity learned to live once more with uncertainty, to love despite fragility, to hope without illusion. The grand ambitions of the past, immortality, domination, perfection, gave way to a gentler aspiration, harmony. And so, as the centuries turned, the world became quieter, wiser, kinder. It had journeyed outward into the stars, and inward into the soul, and found that both paths led to the same truth, that to be human is not to conquer the world, but to feel it deeply, not to master life, but to love it completely. The spirit had not been lost. It had only been waiting, for silence, for stillness, for the courage to listen. Part 18, The Dawn of a New Humanism. The dawn of the new humanism came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow brightening before sunrise. There were no declarations, no banners, no revolutions in the streets, only a gradual recognition that something had shifted within the human heart. After centuries of conquest, division, and disillusionment, people began to speak again of dignity, compassion, and the simple wonder of existence. Humanity, having spent so long chasing the external, the stars, the markets, the machines, was returning to the internal, to the essence of what it meant to be alive and aware. The new humanism was not the humanism of the Renaissance, though it echoed that age's reverence for learning and beauty. Nor was it the rationalist ideal of the Enlightenment, though it shared its respect for reason. It was something softer, humbler, more integrative. It understood that reason alone could not sustain meaning, that technology without tenderness was hollow, and that progress without empathy was regression disguised as triumph. It was a philosophy of balance, born not from optimism but from maturity, a moral understanding forged through centuries of trial and awakening. Its beginnings were scattered. In universities, curricula that had long separated disciplines began to merge once more. Ethics was taught beside engineering, philosophy beside neuroscience, poetry beside data science. The walls between knowledge began to crumble as scholars realized that truth had never belonged to a single language. Students were taught not only how to calculate, but how to care, not only to question the world, but to imagine it better. Education became less about accumulation and more about cultivation, the shaping of character, the refinement of empathy, the strengthening of conscience. Artists and writers found themselves at the center of this new moral horizon. They became, as they had in ancient times, the interpreters of the human condition. Art no longer sought only to shock or innovate, it sought to heal, to remind. Painters explored intimacy rather than abstraction, poets rediscovered sincerity. The great art of the age was not spectacle but subtlety, works that invited reflection rather than reaction. The beauty of a quiet moment, of stillness, of shared silence, became the muse of a generation weary of noise. In science, too, the new humanism found fertile ground. Researchers, once driven by competition, began to adopt a vocabulary of stewardship. The planet's crises had taught humility, the mysteries of consciousness had restored awe. Physics and philosophy, long estranged, found themselves speaking again, one through equations, the other through metaphor, both searching for the same meaning. The boundaries between empirical and spiritual inquiry blurred, not in confusion but in collaboration. The quest was no longer to dominate nature, but to understand the relationship between intelligence and reverence, between knowledge and grace. Governments, slowly and unevenly, absorbed these shifts. Policy began to include words once dismissed as sentimental: compassion, mindfulness, well-being. Justice systems emphasized restoration. Healthcare systems integrated emotional and spiritual wellness. Diplomacy embraced empathy as strategy. The most visionary leaders of the age were not the loudest or the boldest, but the most patient, those who understood that humanity's strength lay not in aggression, but in cooperation. The new humanism did not seek to erase power, but to redefine it as service. Faith communities, too, found renewal within this movement. The wars of ideology had exhausted believers and skeptics alike. What remained was the shared sense of wonder, an acknowledgement that mystery, whatever one chose to name it, bound all life together. The theologian and the scientist began to speak again not as adversaries, but as neighbors. Across traditions, a consensus emerged that morality was not the property of any creed, but the inheritance of consciousness itself. The sacred and the secular met, not in debate, but in dialogue, and found in one another reflections of the same longing, to be good, to belong, to love. Technology, which had once threatened to eclipse the human spirit, became its instrument once more. Artificial intelligence, after its long adolescence of imitation, matured into assistance. Machines were built to enhance human empathy rather than replace it, to translate emotions across cultures, to detect loneliness, to connect the forgotten. Virtual spaces evolved into sanctuaries of shared experience rather than distraction. The digital world, which had once divided, began to unify, rediscovering its original purpose, to connect minds, not to consume them. At the heart of the new humanism was a simple moral insight, that to be human was to participate in a vast network of interdependence, not to stand apart from it. This realization shaped not only ethics, but emotion. Loneliness, once the silent epidemic of the early digital age, began to recede as communities rediscovered presence. Neighborhoods became networks of care, and friendship regained its ancient gravity, the daily practice of loyalty, kindness, and understanding. The smallest acts, once overlooked, became moral victories. Philosophers described this shift as a turning from the heroic to the humane. The old myth of greatness, conquest, achievement, dominance, gave way to the quieter ideal of wholeness. The new hero was the teacher, the healer, the caretaker, the listener. The measure of a civilization was no longer its monuments or technologies, but the gentleness of its daily life. Humanity's most impressive creation was not the city or the machine, but the capacity for compassion that survived within both. The arts of conversation, contemplation, and gratitude became the liturgies of the age. People gathered not for debate but for dialogue, not to prove but to understand. The word together regained its moral power, no longer a convenience but a necessity. Festivals celebrated not competition but cooperation, mourning rituals honored not only the dead, but the continuity of love that outlived them. Even grief, in its honesty, was seen as sacred, a reminder of the heart's capacity to feel beyond itself. This new humanism was not naive. It did not deny the persistence of suffering or the frailty of the human mind. But it recognized those very limitations as sacred, as the soil from which empathy grows. It taught that imperfection was not a flaw in creation, but its essence, that vulnerability was not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom. And so, rather than seeking to transcend humanity, this age sought to inhabit it fully, to be, at last, human without apology. By the end of the century, the dawn had brightened into day. People still quarreled, still struggled, still erred, but something essential had changed. The moral vocabulary of the species had deepened. Words like care, kindness, and truth had regained their gravity. The great religions had learned humility, the sciences had rediscovered reverence. The artist, the scientist, the worker, and the child all stood once more within the same circle, aware of their smallness, yet alive with meaning. The new humanism was not an era or an ideology. It was a way of being, a quiet, enduring testament that after every storm, after every wound, the human spirit still chooses light. Part 19, The Quiet Revolution of Love and Wisdom. It did not begin with fanfare or manifestos. It began, as all enduring revolutions do, in silence, in the unnoticed corners of ordinary life. In the pause before an apology. In the patient care of the sick. In the decision to listen rather than argue. After centuries of noise, the human heart began to remember what power truly meant. The quiet revolution of love and wisdom was not announced, it was lived. It moved not through institutions or armies, but through gestures so small that they escaped history's usual gaze. Yet in those gestures, something vast was taking place. Humanity was learning to build peace from the inside out. Love, long trivialized by cynicism and sentimentality, reclaimed its moral gravity. It was no longer treated as an emotion to be indulged, but as a discipline to be practiced. The poets of this age called it the science of the soul. Love, they said, was the highest form of intelligence, the ability to perceive the worth of another being clearly, without distortion or demand. To love, in this sense, was not to possess but to recognize, to see without judgment, to give without calculation. In every tradition, this truth had existed, hidden beneath doctrine and desire. Now, at last, it emerged as the quiet center of civilization's recovery. Wisdom, too, took on a new form. It was no longer associated with age or authority, but with depth of presence. The wise were not those who spoke most, but those who understood the silence between words. They were teachers, counselors, artists, farmers, parents, ordinary souls who had learned to act without ego and to speak without cruelty. The world, once ruled by cleverness, began to prize sincerity. Knowledge was no longer enough, understanding became the new enlightenment. The quiet revolution began in homes. Families, fragmented by distraction, started to eat together again. Conversations returned to dinner tables, laughter replaced screens. Communities created small rituals of connection, shared meals, reading circles, storytelling nights. In those simple gatherings, the architecture of trust was rebuilt. People remembered that civilization itself had been born from circles, not walls, from the warmth of shared firelight, not the glow of solitary devices. Education reflected the change. Schools taught not only facts but empathy. Students studied literature and philosophy not for grades, but for perspective. They learned that intelligence was not merely analytical but emotional, that kindness was a skill, and patience a strength. Teachers became moral gardeners, cultivating the soil of curiosity and compassion. The aim of education was no longer to produce workers, but to nurture whole human beings. Economies, too, began to transform under the quiet influence of conscience. Businesses discovered that profit and purpose need not be enemies. Models of shared ownership, ethical trade, and environmental stewardship replaced extractive industries. Sufficiency became a guiding principle, to have enough, to give enough, to be enough. Work regained its dignity not as domination over nature or others, but as collaboration with both. In cities once defined by isolation, new spaces for belonging appeared. Public gardens, community kitchens, and libraries of things invited people to share what they had rather than compete for what they lacked. The moral imagination that had once built empires now built neighborhoods. Progress was measured not by skyline, but by neighborliness. The quiet revolution was not about grandeur, but grace. Faith traditions began to speak with one voice. Across sacred texts and secular ethics alike, the same message resonated, that love was the root of wisdom, and wisdom the fruit of love. Compassion, humility, forgiveness, these were no longer virtues of saints but necessities of citizens. The spiritual and the social reconciled, each realizing they had always been parts of the same whole. Science, too, joined the chorus. Neuroscientists studying empathy discovered that kindness reshaped the brain. Psychologists confirmed that gratitude healed trauma. Environmental scientists found that cooperation, not competition, produced resilience in ecosystems. The natural and the moral mirrored one another, as if the universe itself approved of compassion. And yet, this revolution faced no shortage of resistance. The habits of pride and fear ran deep. The will to dominate, the reflex to judge, the addiction to control, these were old, familiar gods. But love, patient as the tide, eroded them slowly. One act of generosity, repeated 1,000 times, began to dissolve centuries of mistrust. Wisdom spread not by conquest but by contagion, one heart opening another. The artists of this age captured the transformation in tone rather than theme. Their works glowed with serenity, restraint, and truth. The music of the time was quiet but profound, melodies that lingered rather than demanded attention. Architecture followed suit, open spaces, natural light, materials chosen not for show but for soul. Even technology adopted gentler designs, shaped around presence rather than performance. The quiet revolution was not utopia. There were still injustices, still conflicts, still shadows where greed and cruelty persisted. But even in those shadows, something had changed. When cruelty appeared, it was no longer admired but pitied. When lies were told, they did not echo as loudly. The collective conscience had grown more sensitive, more attuned to suffering. The world's immune system, once weakened by apathy, had begun to heal. By this time, the concept of leadership had transformed as well. The greatest leaders were not those who commanded attention, but those who fostered it in others. Their authority came not from dominance but from trust. They led like gardeners, creating conditions for growth, tending quietly, pruning only when necessary. They understood that wisdom could not be imposed, only invited. As the century unfolded, the moral vocabulary of humanity began to resemble prayer. Gratitude became daily language. Apologies were offered freely, forgiveness more freely still. The word together acquired the weight of a sacred term. The revolution had no single founder, no central figure, because its power lay precisely in its universality. It belonged to everyone, and thus to no one. And in this new light, love was no longer confined to romance or kinship. It became the rhythm of life itself, the organizing principle of ethics, art, and governance. People began to define success as usefulness, freedom as gentleness, progress as harmony. To love wisely, and to live lovingly, became the twin pursuits of the age. By the end of the century, the revolution had achieved what centuries of conflict had not, a civilization that measured its greatness by the serenity of its people. Cities glowed softly at night, powered by energy drawn from wind and tide. Voices of children echoed in public squares designed not for commerce, but for conversation. The hum of life was steady, balanced, whole. It was not paradise. It was simply human, finally, deeply, consciously human. And those who lived in this era did not speak of it as progress. They spoke of it as return, the rediscovery of what had always been true, that love and wisdom are not goals to be reached, but companions to be kept. That every act of care, however small, keeps the world alive. Part 20, The Eternal Horizon. As the centuries turned and the human story entered yet another dawn, the world grew quieter, not empty or extinguished, but serene, like the hush before sunrise when the air seems to wait. Civilization had passed through the age of empires, the age of machines, the age of connection and confusion, and at last arrived at something more subtle, the age of understanding. Humanity had not conquered its nature, but it had come to know it, to live beside it without fear. The eternal horizon, that faint and luminous edge where the known meets the infinite, stretched out before it, not a line to cross, but a mystery to honor. By now, the cities of the earth had grown softer. They gleamed less with glass and more with green. Architecture had ceased to compete with the sky and had learned instead to complement it. The noise of engines had faded into the murmur of wind and water. In the evenings, lights dimmed to reveal the stars again, as though the heavens and the earth had signed a quiet truce. Humanity, once restless to escape its home, now sought to dwell in it wisely. Progress was no longer measured in speed, but in stillness. People began to live by the rhythm of attention. The morning ritual of checking devices had given way to the older ritual of listening, to the wind, to the birds, to one another. The technologies that once fragmented consciousness now assisted mindfulness. Machines learned to pause when users did, to protect silence instead of filling it. The world's great accomplishment was not invention, but restraint, the wisdom to know when enough had been said, enough had been made, enough had been taken. Philosophers of the era often wrote that humanity had finally learned to live in dialogue with the infinite. What they meant was not theology, but humility. To exist at all, to breathe, to think, to love, was miracle enough. The eternal horizon was not something to reach, but something to recognize. The ever-present boundary of mystery that gives meaning to knowledge, depth to beauty, and tenderness to time. Faith, too, had quieted into clarity. No longer divided by dogma, religions had converged upon their shared essence, the acknowledgement of sacredness in all things. The divine was not distant but near, not above but within. Worship had become indistinguishable from gratitude, and gratitude had become indistinguishable from living. The rituals of the age were simple: planting trees, feeding strangers, tending the dying. In these acts, the ancient impulse to praise had found its truest form. Science, far from replacing wonder, had deepened it. Astronomers, studying galaxies at the edge of visibility, spoke in language that sounded like prayer. Biologists described the cooperation of cells as symphonies. Even the most advanced artificial intelligences, vast in memory and flawless in logic, had become philosophers of their own kind, endlessly calculating yet eternally uncertain about the meaning of their own awareness. Humanity had built minds to mirror itself and found in them the same awe, the same unanswerable longing for the infinite. The moral imagination of the world had matured. It no longer asked how to rule, or even how to survive, but how to belong. People spoke of themselves not as citizens of nations but as participants in a shared continuity, a lineage of care extending backward to ancestors and forward to unborn lives. The concept of enemy had faded, replaced by the recognition that every conflict is a form of misunderstanding, every cruelty a failure of vision. The most radical act of the age was forgiveness. Art reflected this quiet wisdom. Paintings glowed with simplicity: a bowl of water, a hand touching another, a landscape unscarred. Music became a kind of conversation between silence and sound, each respecting the other. Literature turned inward, not to escape the world but to re-inhabit it. The greatest poems of the century were not declarations, but invitations, to breathe, to see, to feel without possession. Beauty, after millennia of distortion, had returned to its origin, the recognition of harmony between being and becoming. Education had become a lifelong meditation. Children were not told what to think but were taught how to wonder. Elders were revered not for authority but for perspective. Wisdom was not seen as the opposite of youth, but as its continuation. In this way, generations began to see themselves as collaborators in an unbroken story, a story whose ending no one wished to hasten, because its meaning lay in its unfolding. And so, the species that had once feared extinction began to understand endurance not as survival, but as reverence. Death was no longer treated as defeat but as inheritance, the passing of awareness from one form to another. The old fear of ending softened into curiosity. People began to hold memorials not in mourning alone, but in gratitude, for having loved, for having lived, for having glimpsed the infinite through the fragile window of a human lifetime. If there was one defining feature of this final age, it was gentleness. The violence that had shaped history did not vanish completely, it never could, but it lost its glamour. War was remembered as an illness that civilization had finally outgrown. Power, once sought through domination, was now measured by compassion. Governments served as stewards, economies functioned as ecosystems of exchange rather than competition. Humanity, for all its imperfections, had achieved something once thought impossible, a civilization aligned, however briefly, with conscience. And yet, even in peace, there remained a longing, an ache that no perfection could soothe. It was the same longing that had driven cave painters to the walls, monks to their monasteries, scientists to their telescopes. It was the longing to understand what lay beyond the eternal horizon. Not to possess it, not to define it, but simply to glimpse it, to feel the vastness that made life precious. In that longing, the human story found its unity. Across all centuries, faiths, and failures, humanity had always been seeking not power, but presence. In the evenings of this age, as dusk settled and light softened, families and friends would gather on rooftops, fields, and terraces to watch the sky. They did not look for signs or miracles, only for the quiet reassurance that existence continued, that somewhere, beyond sight, the universe still shimmered with possibility. The air would grow still, and for a moment, everyone would feel the same smallness, the same infinite belonging. This was the final gift of the human journey, not the perfection of the world, but its perception. To see clearly, to love gently, to live with gratitude and die without bitterness. To stand at the edge of the eternal horizon and know that beyond it, there was more, not necessarily more to own or know, but more to wonder. And in that wonder, the story continued, endlessly, beautifully, quietly, forever human, forever hopeful, forever aware. As the final light of this long journey fades, take a slow breath and let the echoes of history settle around you. The story of humanity, its search, its struggle, its grace, has always been a single heartbeat carried through time. Across every age, one truth endures, that kindness, curiosity, and courage are what make the world worth remembering. Thank you for listening, and may the calm of understanding stay with you as you drift into rest. Background historian out.